The breakfast tray hit the wall at 4:47 in the morning. Not dropped. Hurled. The stainless steel caught the fluorescent light on its way across the psychiatric ward hallway, spinning like a blade before it exploded against the cinder block with a sound that rattled every window on the floor. Scrambled eggs and lukewarm coffee splattered across 3 feet of wall. The orderly who'd brought it was already running. 2 nurses sprinted for the stairwell. A third froze in the doorway of the medication room, her hand pressed flat against her own chest like she was trying to hold her heart in place. Room 14 was screaming. Not words, sound. Raw, tearing, animal sound. The kind that comes from somewhere below language, below reason, below anything a person can control. Inside, a 210-pound former Special Forces operator was dismantling his room with his bare hands, and the security desk had already called for a sedation team because nobody on this floor had any idea what else to do. Nobody except the blonde nurse standing at the end of the hallway, who hadn't moved an inch. Before we go any further, if stories like this one hit different for you, the kind that make you sit up straight and forget to blink, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week, this channel brings you real cinematic fiction built for people who want more than noise. Drop a like if you're staying till the end, and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Montana. Redstone Veterans Medical Center sat at the eastern edge of Grover Falls, a mid-sized Montana city that smelled like pine resin and diesel in equal measure, sandwiched between a defunct rail yard and the kind of main street that had 3 coffee shops and zero urgency. The medical center itself was a sprawling, underfunded campus that had been built in 3 separate decades by 3 separate architects who apparently never spoke to each other, resulting in a building that made no visual sense from the outside and even less from within. The psychiatric ward, Ward 4, though staff had taken to calling it the basement even though it was on the 2nd floor, was where Redstone sent the cases it didn't know what to do with. Combat vets with PTSD that had calcified into something harder and stranger. Men who'd spent years in places the government still didn't officially acknowledge, who came back carrying things that had no clinical name. The ward smelled like industrial cleaner and stale air, and the lighting was the color of old teeth. Claire Whitmore had been assigned there on her 3rd day. She was 29, not 28. The intake paperwork had a typo nobody corrected. And she'd been hired 6 weeks earlier as a per diem RN with a 6-month probationary contract, the kind of arrangement that gave the hospital total flexibility to cut her loose if anything went sideways. She had submitted her application quietly, without a cover letter that might raise questions, without references that might prompt a deeper background check. Just her nursing credentials, her civilian licensure, and a 2-year employment gap she listed as private healthcare consulting. Nobody pushed on the gap. That was fine with Claire. She was not tall, she was not imposing. She had the kind of face that people forgot within minutes of looking away. Not unattractive, just unremarkable. Blonde hair usually pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency rather than effort. Gray-green eyes that stayed level and quiet in almost any situation. The charge nurse on Ward 4, a broad-shouldered woman named Peg Dolan, who had been working the floor for 11 years and had the posture of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything, had looked Claire up and down on her first morning and said, without particular cruelty, "Try not to take it personally when they yell at you, and don't turn your back on room 14. "What's in room 14? Claire had asked. Peg had handed her a medication cart key and walked away. She found out what was in room 14 on her 2nd shift. Sergeant Major Devlin Marsh, retired, though the Army didn't always feel retired to him, had been brought into Redstone 11 days earlier by local law enforcement after a neighbor called about noise complaints that escalated to a welfare check that escalated to a situation requiring 4 officers and a promise of voluntary admission that wasn't entirely voluntary. He was 43 years old, a former Special Forces operator with 2 decades of service, and a chest full of commendations that his file mentioned only in passing, as though they were embarrassing rather than relevant. His chart at Redstone described him as agitated, non-compliant, resistant to therapeutic engagement, possible paranoid ideation. Claire had read that chart twice and noticed what wasn't in it. No mention of the service dog that had apparently been with him at intake, and then wasn't. No notation about the medication change that had happened on day 3. A switch from the regimen his private physician had prescribed to something Redstone staff psychiatrist, a Dr. Roland Fitch, had substituted without documented justification. And no explanation for why a man with Devlin Marsh's service record and no prior psychiatric hospitalizations had, within 11 days of arriving at this facility, become so destabilized that he was now throwing trays at walls before 5 in the morning. Claire had noticed all of this quietly, the way she noticed most things, without announcing it. She was standing at the end of the hallway when the tray hit the wall because she'd been reviewing the overnight medication log when the sound started, and instead of the survival instinct that had sent every other staff member in the opposite direction, something older and more practiced had moved her feet toward it. The sedation team was 2 minutes out. She could hear Peg on the phone at the nursing station, voice tight and controlled. Claire walked to the door of room 14. The inside looked like a small storm had passed through it. The mattress was on its side. The bedside table was overturned. A plastic water pitcher had made it about 4 feet before hitting the window. Devlin Marsh was standing in the center of the room with his back to the wall, breathing like he'd just surfaced from deep water, hands open and shaking at his sides. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that didn't go away just because someone put him in a hospital gown. And his eyes were doing something Claire recognized. They were scanning, not the room, the exits, the angles, the threat assessments that the brain never fully unlearns once it's been trained to see the world that way. She stepped into the doorway. "Hey," she said. Not loud. Not the careful, elevated voice people used when they were afraid. Just, hey, the way you'd say it to someone you'd passed in a hallway a dozen times. Devlin's head snapped toward her. She didn't step back. "At ease," she said. The 2 words came out low and flat and without hesitation, and something in them, the cadence, the register, the complete absence of fear, hit him differently than anything the staff had tried in 11 days. His whole frame shifted. Not relaxed, not instantly, but the scanning stopped. His eyes focused on her face instead of the exits. "Who are you?" His voice was raw. "Claire Whitmore. I'm on nights this week." "Where's Dolan?" "On the phone, calling the team that's going to come in here and sedate you if you don't give me 2 minutes." Something moved across his face. Not quite humor. The ghost of it. 2 minutes, he said. 2 minutes. She leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. Not all the way in, not all the way out. A position that communicated neither threat nor retreat. What happened to the tray? It moved wrong. She didn't ask what that meant. She already understood what it meant. The scrambled eggs. They put something in it. Devlin. She said it the same way she'd said at ease. Level, no condescension, no theatrical patience. They didn't put anything in your eggs. The problem is what they put in your IV on Tuesday. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. He looked at her for a long moment. "You read my chart." "I read your chart twice." "Fitch changed my lithium carbonate to valproate. Undocumented. No sign-off from your primary." She watched his face. "You felt the difference around day 4. "I felt like I was losing my mind," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact, stated with the flatness of someone who'd processed it into something manageable. "That's not a feeling I know how to handle." "I know." "You don't know me." "No, but I know the feeling." She pushed off the doorframe and stood fully upright. "The team is going to be here in about 90 seconds. You can let them come in, or you can come with me to the day room, and I'll get you actual coffee from the staff kitchen, and you can tell me what happened to your dog." Another silence. "How do you know about the dog?" "Intake notes mention him. Nothing after that." She paused. "That matters. That's a service animal. Whoever separated you from him needed documentation and a reason, and I haven't found either." Devlin Marsh looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he crossed the room and walked past her into the hallway. Peg Dolan found them in the day room at 5:15 a.m., sitting across from each other at one of the plastic tables. Claire with a cup of coffee, and Devlin with his hands wrapped around the same, neither of them talking loudly enough to carry. Peg stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that suggested she was revising several of her earlier assessments, then walked back to the nursing station without saying anything. The sedation team was dismissed. Dr. Fitch arrived at 7 when the morning shift was coming on and was told by the overnight charge that the incident had been resolved. He looked at the incident report, looked at the name signed at the bottom, C. Whitmore, RN, and made a face like he'd bitten into something unexpectedly sour. He didn't say anything then, but Claire noticed the face. She was good at noticing faces. The thing about Ward 4 was that it ran on a kind of institutional logic that had calcified over years into something that looked like protocol, but was actually just inertia. The nurses did their rounds, dispensed their medications, documented their observations in language that was clinical to the point of meaninglessness, and kept a certain careful professional distance from the men and women on the floor because getting too close made the work harder. That was the received wisdom. Peg had said it on Claire's first week. Don't get attached. They're here to be stabilized, not saved. Claire had said, sure, and meant something different. She'd spent the next week doing what she always did, watching. Not intrusively, not in ways that drew attention, just the ordinary attentiveness of someone who had been trained to read a situation in seconds and identify the variables that mattered. She watched the medication rounds. She watched which patients were more agitated after visiting hours than before. She watched how the nursing staff talked to the patients versus how they talked about them in the break room. And she watched Devlin Marsh. He was not what his chart described. He was sharp, sharper than anyone on the ward seemed to have noticed, or maybe sharper than anyone had wanted to notice. In the group sessions he attended in mandatory silence, she could see him cataloging the room's exits and the staff's positions and the behavioral patterns of the other patients with the same quiet efficiency she used herself. He was not paranoid. He was observant, which was not the same thing, but which could look the same to someone who didn't know the difference. And every time she came on shift, she found his medication log. She'd started keeping a personal copy on day 5, not because she planned to do anything with it yet, just because the discrepancies she'd found on day 2 hadn't resolved themselves. They'd multiplied. The valproate dosage had been adjusted upward twice without corresponding notes from Dr. Fitch. A new anxiolytic had been added that wasn't flagged in his allergy review. And the physical therapy appointments that had been in his original care plan had been quietly removed and not replaced. On Wednesday morning, 9 days after she'd walked him down from the tray incident, she made the mistake, or maybe the conscious decision, she wasn't sure which, of bringing her concerns directly to Dr. Fitch. She caught him in the hallway outside the medication room, between morning rounds. He was a compact, silver-haired man with the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years in administrative medicine, which meant he'd spent 30 years learning to look busy without being interrupted. He had small hands and a large office and spoke to nursing staff with the specific courtesy that was designed to communicate that he was, in fact, barely speaking to them at all. Dr. Fitch, she said, I had a question about Marsh in room 14. He paused, glancing at her badge. Whitmore? Yes, sir, his valproate dosage. It's been adjusted twice in the last 6 days, and I can't find the corresponding chart notes. Dosage adjustments are within my clinical discretion. They are, but the pharmacy protocol requires documentation within 24 hours. There isn't any. A brief pause. I'll review it. I also couldn't find paperwork on the service dog, the one that was with him at intake. There's no documentation of why it was removed, and under federal law, I know the law, Ms. Whitmore. His voice hadn't changed in volume or temperature, but something behind his eyes did. Are you a first-year RN? No, sir. You're on probation. Yes. Then I'd strongly encourage you to focus on doing your job and let the physicians do theirs. He looked at her for one additional second, the kind of look that was meant to land somewhere between warning and dismissal, and then walked away. Claire stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went back to the nursing station and pulled up Devlin Marsh's intake file. The dog's name was Hatch. She found it in a single line of the original intake notes. Patient accompanied by trained service animal, Hatch, male Belgian Malinois, approx. 4 years, cert, ID on collar, and nothing after. No transfer documentation, no waiver, no voluntary surrender form. Under the relevant federal statutes, a service animal supporting a patient with documented psychiatric disability could not simply be removed. There was a process, there was paperwork, there was supposed to be a 30-day accommodation review before any separation. None of it existed. She spent her entire lunch break with this, in the break room with the door mostly closed, pulling up every regulation she could access on the hospital's internal system. When she came back out, Peg Dolan was waiting for her. Peg was a large woman with forearms that suggested she'd done physical work for most of her life, and she had a way of occupying a hallway that communicated, without aggression, that she was a fact of the landscape. She looked at Claire the way you look at someone who is about to do something complicated. "You went to Fitch," Peg said. "I had a question about a patient." "You had an accusation about a physician." "I had a documentation concern." Peg exhaled through her nose. "Whitmore, I don't know where you worked before. I don't know what kind of nursing you've done, but here's what I know about this ward, and I want you to actually hear it." She lowered her voice without losing any of its directness. "People who go looking for problems at Redstone have a way of finding problems. Of a different kind. You understand?" Claire looked at her steadily. "I'm not looking for problems." "Then close your notebook and do your rounds." Claire closed the notebook. She did her rounds. And at 11:15 that night, she started a second notebook at home. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 14 days after her first shift on Ward 4, that things changed direction in a way Claire had not anticipated. She'd been doing a routine check on room 14. Devlin was in occupational therapy, which he'd agreed to attend partly because it got him out of the room, and partly, she suspected, because it gave him something to observe. When she noticed his IV line, the new anxiolytic was dripping at a rate that was wrong. She didn't hesitate. She checked the order against the pharmacy sheet against the line setting and confirmed the discrepancy in about 45 seconds, then reached for the adjustment. She'd almost finished it when the overhead page crackled, and then someone was shouting from the hallway, and she came out to find Devlin Marsh collapsed on the floor of the OT room with his body in the rigid, arching posture of a grand mal seizure, and 3 staff members standing in a semicircle around him doing exactly nothing useful. "Move," she said. They moved. What happened in the next 6 minutes was not graceful. It was not the kind of thing that looked good in medical dramas, with their slow heroics and meaningful glances. It was fast and loud and messy, and Claire was on her knees on the floor with her watch in one hand and her brain running through a checklist that had been drilled into her in a context these people knew nothing about. She called for the crash kit. She called for neurology. She called for someone to kill the IV line and get her a timeline on his last dose adjustment. When the charge nurse started to argue about whether the neurologist needed to be paged first, Claire used a voice she almost never used anymore, the one that had a rank behind it even if nobody here knew that, and the charge nurse went and paged the neurologist. When Dr. Anita Vasquez from neurology arrived 4 minutes later and assessed the situation, she looked at Claire once with the expression of someone who is recalibrating quickly. "Good positioning," Vasquez said. "Standard protocol." "It wasn't standard anything." Vasquez glanced at the monitoring numbers, then at Claire. "Where did you learn to manage status epilepticus under field conditions?" Claire said, "Night shift." She stood up, stripped her gloves. "He needs a full medication review before any neurological workup. The valproate dosage history is documented in my personal notes if you need it." Vasquez stared at her for a moment longer than was necessary. Then Devlin started to come back, slow and disoriented the way people always were after a seizure, looking around the room with eyes that weren't finding anything yet, and Claire crouched down beside him again because that was the job she was actually there to do. He found her face eventually. "Still here," he said. His voice was stripped down, the kind of bear you only got after something like that. "Still here," she confirmed. He looked at the ceiling, exhaled. "Hatch," he said quietly. "I know," Claire said. "I'm working on it." She was called into hospital director Dr. Meredith Strand's office the next morning. Strand was 61, Yale Medical School, the kind of administrator who had the vocabulary of progressivism and the operating principles of someone who had worked very hard to get to a position where they no longer had to explain themselves. She had framed certificates on 3 walls and a view of the parking lot on the 4th, and she looked at Claire across her desk with the careful expression of someone delivering a reasonable conversation. "Sit down, Ms. Whitmore." Claire sat. "I've heard very good things about your quick response yesterday. Very impressive." Strand folded her hands. "I also understand you've been raising documentation concerns with Dr. Fitch. I found discrepancies in a patient's medication record that fell outside standard protocol, which have been reviewed and addressed by Dr. Fitch and the pharmacy director. I wasn't informed of that review." "You wouldn't be, Miss Whitmore. It was a physician-level process." The smile stayed exactly where it was. I want you to know that we take clinical accuracy very seriously here. And I also want to say directly that a probationary nurse raising allegations against a senior physician is an extraordinary step that requires an equally extraordinary level of certainty. I didn't raise allegations. I raised documentation questions. Of course. Strand looked down at something on her desk. You're currently on a per diem contract through the end of the month. We're doing performance reviews this cycle, and I want us to be thinking together about how best to position you for renewal, which means I want to see you thriving, Ms. Whitmore, focused, not distracted by things outside your scope of practice. Claire looked at her for a moment. Is that clear? Strand said. Very, Claire said. She stood up and she walked out of the office, and in the elevator on the way back to Ward 4, she did the math and understood that she had approximately 3 weeks before her contract was not renewed, and that the only question was whether they would move against her before that or let the calendar do the work. She got back to the ward. She checked room 14. Devlin was sitting up in bed, clear-eyed and grimly alert, and he looked at her face when she walked in and said, How bad? They're managing me. They do that. He looked at the window. I had a CO once who said the same thing about difficult personnel, right before he paperworked 3 of them out of the unit. What did the 3 of them do? Found out something he didn't want found. Claire sat down in the chair beside his bed and looked at the ceiling. Outside in the hallway, she could hear the medication cart making its rounds, its familiar mechanical squeal, the ordinary sounds of a ward doing its ordinary work. Somewhere under all of it, something was very wrong, and she'd been close enough to it for 2 weeks to start feeling its shape, even if she couldn't see its edges yet. They took your dog on day 2, she said. Day 2, Devlin confirmed. Some administrator I never saw again told me it was policy. No animal visitors during initial stabilization. He looked at her. That's not policy. No, it's not. She turned her head to look at him. And the medication change. Fitch told me the lithium was causing side effects. Said the new medication was better for acute presentation. He paused. It wasn't better. No. She was quiet for a moment. When did it start? The feeling that something was off. He thought about it. He was good at thinking about things carefully, she'd noticed, taking his time in a way that probably read as slowness to people who weren't paying attention. Day 4, maybe 5. I started losing time, not blacking out, just losing the thread of things, going from morning to afternoon and not being sure what happened in between. His jaw tightened. That's not a symptom I came in with. I know. She stood up, picking up the tablet she'd set on the windowsill. Devlin, I need you to tell me, were there other people before you came here? Other guys you served with who were having similar problems? Something shifted in his face, just for a moment before he controlled it. Why are you asking that? He said. Because I've been looking at your records and I found 2 other Ward 4 admissions from the last 18 months with a near identical pattern. Different diagnoses on paper, different physicians, but the same medication substitutions within the first week of admission, the same documentation gaps, and both of them transferred to long-term facilities outside of Montana before their families could request independent reviews. The silence that followed was the heaviest one yet. Outside, the medication cart squealed past the door. Yeah, Devlin said quietly. There were others. And then he said 2 names, and Claire's chest did something she hadn't expected. A specific lurch of recognition that she controlled before it reached her face, because she knew those names. Not personally, but she knew them in the way you knew certain names when you'd moved in certain circles. And the fact that those 2 specific men had ended up at Redstone Medical Center in Grover Falls, Montana, was not a coincidence that had any innocent explanation. She looked at him. He looked at her. Who are you? He said. It was the same question he'd asked her the first morning, but it meant something entirely different now. She didn't answer yet. She tucked the tablet under her arm and walked to the door and looked both ways down the hallway with the old automatic sweep she'd never fully stopped doing. Get some sleep, she said. I have some calls to make. She walked down the hallway toward the stairwell, and her face was completely composed, and her mind was moving very fast because she had just recognized the shape of something large, and she had 3 weeks, maybe less, to figure out what to do about it. The calls she needed to make couldn't happen from her phone. That was the first thing she understood walking down the stairwell. her footsteps careful and quiet out of old habit, hand trailing the painted cinder block without touching it. Not her personal cell, too easy to flag on a hospital network that had almost certainly been logging her activities since the morning she went to Fitch. She needed a prepaid or a landline outside the building, and she needed to think carefully about who she was calling before she called anyone. She pushed through the ground floor exit into the parking lot and stood in the cold Montana air for a moment, letting it do what cold air did. It was just past 9 at night. The lot was half empty, the kind of institutional quiet that settles over medical facilities after visiting hours when the building is still running but the witnesses have gone home. She could see the mountains in the dark beyond the city's edge, a black absence against a sky with too many stars. And she stood there long enough to feel her breathing even out, and her mind settle into the kind of stillness that she used to have to train for, and now just happened. 2 names. Devlin had said them like he was handing her something breakable, watching her face for the reaction she'd managed not to show. Marcus Webb, Terrence Polk. Both former special operations, both with service histories that existed in the kind of classified overlap that meant their records were accessible only at certain clearance levels. She knew their names because she'd overlapped with the unit Webb had trained with during her second deployment, and Polk's name had come up in a debrief she'd sat in on during her last operational year. A debrief that had nothing to do with psychiatric hospitals in Montana and everything to do with a classified program that was officially discontinued. Officially. She walked to a gas station 3 blocks east and bought a prepaid phone with cash. And then she sat in her car in the gas station lot with the engine running for warmth and thought for 11 minutes about who she was going to call. Not the VA regional office. She'd already determined they were either compromised or too slow for what she was looking at. Not local law enforcement, who had no jurisdiction over federal medical facilities and no context for the kind of thing she was beginning to think this was. She called a number she hadn't dialed in 2 years and hoped it still worked. It picked up on the 3rd ring. "Whoever this is," said a voice that was familiar in the way of old machinery. Functional, reliable, not particularly warm. "You're calling a retired man on a Tuesday evening." "It's Whitmore," she said. A pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4. "I heard you got out," the voice said. "I did. And now?" "I'm a nurse." Another pause, this one with a different quality. "Where?" "Redstone Veterans Medical Center, Grover Falls, Montana." She let that sit. The silence on the other end changed in a way she recognized. Became less casual. "What are you looking at?" "I'm not sure yet, but I've got a sergeant major in the psych ward who should not be there, a medication history that doesn't hold up clinically, and 2 names from his unit that I need you to run quietly." She gave him the names. Marcus Webb. Terrence Polk. This time the silence was longer. "I'll make some calls," said the voice, and it was no longer the voice of a retired man on a Tuesday evening. "Don't go through official channels yet," she said. "I know how to do this, Whitmore." "I know you do." She looked out the windshield at the gas station fluorescents. "I've got maybe 3 weeks before this hospital finds a way to remove me. Probably less. Then keep your head down until I get back to you." She hung up, sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, then drove back to her apartment and didn't sleep for a long time. Keeping her head down was easier said than done when the thing you'd noticed couldn't be unnoticed. She went back to work the next morning and did everything correctly. Her rounds, her documentation, her interactions with Dr. Fitch conducted with the professional blankness of someone who had never raised a concern in her life. She said good morning to Peg Dolan. She attended the unit briefing. She administered medications on schedule and charted everything with the kind of meticulous accuracy that was, itself, a form of documentation, because every entry was time-stamped and logged and would exist somewhere even if she didn't. She visited room 14 during her rounds. Devlin was sitting at the edge of his bed, dressed, which meant he'd been up for a while and the restlessness was building. He looked at her when she came in and didn't say anything immediately, which she'd learned was how he communicated that he was thinking. "You know something," he said, after she'd done the routine checks. "I made some calls last night." "To who?" "Someone who knows how to ask questions without leaving a trail." She logged a notation in his chart, vital stable, patient alert, and oriented, and then looked at him directly. "I need you to do something for me." "Depends what it is." "I need you to be boring for the next couple of weeks. No incidents, no pushing back against the staff. Take the medications, She lowered her voice. "The ones I've documented, and if anything changes in how you feel physically, you tell me immediately. Not the charge nurse. Me." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite compliance and not quite resistance, but somewhere in between where men who'd spent their lives operating in difficult situations tended to live. "You think it's bigger than just this hospital," he said. It wasn't a question. "I think I don't know yet," she said, "and I'd rather be wrong than push before I understand the shape of it." He nodded once, slowly. Then, Hatch is a Malinois, Belgian, 4 years old. He's trained in psychiatric alert, seizure detection, grounding protocols, nightmare interruption. He said it the way he said most things, matter of fact, but she could hear what was underneath it. "I haven't slept more than 2 hours straight since they took him." She wrote something in her notebook, not in the chart. "I'll find out where he is," she said. She meant it. That was the problem with meaning things. It kept expanding the scope of what you were doing. She found out where Hatch was on day 17, and the answer made something solidify in her chest that had previously been only soft suspicion. The dog wasn't at a local kennel. He wasn't with a foster handler or a temporary VA placement service. He had been transferred to a private veterinary boarding facility 40 miles outside Grover Falls, registered under the name of a holding company that had no obvious connection to Redstone Medical Center, but which, when she traced its registered agent through the state business filing database, shared a mailing address with a consulting firm that had contracts with the hospital. She sat with that information for a day before she did anything with it, running it through every innocent explanation she could construct. Maybe it was a paperwork coincidence. Maybe the holding company was something generic, an LLC that did a dozen different things. Maybe the mailing address was a shared office building and the connection was meaningless. She was good at testing explanations, though. She'd been trained to construct the most charitable version of a scenario and then test it against the evidence, and the most charitable version kept failing. If it was a paperwork coincidence, there would be VA documentation for the transfer. There wasn't. If the holding company was generic, it would have a history of other business activity. It didn't. It had been registered 14 months ago with a single stated purpose that was vague enough to be anything. 14 months ago was right around when the first of the two names Devlin had given her, Marcus Webb, had been admitted to Redstone and then quietly transferred out. She added it to the second notebook. The second notebook lived in her car, not her apartment, in a waterproof bag zip-tied inside the spare tire well. She'd learned certain things about document security at a point in her life when it had been professionally relevant, and those habits didn't leave you just because your job title changed. On day 19, Dr. Fitch changed Devlin's medication again. Claire found out not because she was watching his chart. She'd been deliberately reducing her visible interest in room 14 since the meeting with Strand, but because Devlin flagged her during a routine pass through the ward, a brief look that in 2 weeks had developed into something she could read clearly. She doubled back and went into his room under the pretense of checking his blood pressure. "New prescription," he said, keeping his voice down. "Different bottle this morning. Dolan said it was a routine adjustment. Did you take it?" I held it under my tongue and spit it out after she left. A beat. Old habit. Claire felt something that she decided was not quite relief and not quite alarm. It was the specific feeling of a variable you'd accounted for behaving exactly as expected, which was different from comfort. "Good. Don't do it every time. They'll notice. But save whatever you can and give it to me." He passed her a small folded piece of tissue. She pocketed it and finished the blood pressure notation and walked out. The medication was sent out that night through a chain of 3 different people, none of whom knew what they were handling or who it belonged to a private toxicology lab in Billings that a former colleague of hers had used for independent analysis work. She paid in cash and listed herself under a name that was spelled differently than anything in Redstone's system. She got results in 48 hours. The new medication was not what the label said it was. It was a combination that was, in the quantities present, consistent with producing extended cognitive impairment, confusion, and susceptibility to suggestion in a patient who was already being managed with valproate. It was not a recognized psychiatric protocol. It was not a combination that any legitimate physician would prescribe. She sat in her car in the hospital parking lot and read the lab report on her phone for a very long time. Then she called the prepaid number she'd been checking for messages. He picked up immediately this time. "Whitmore." I have toxicology results, she said. I need to know what you found on the names. A short pause. Webb is in a private facility outside Butte, not a VA affiliate, a private psychiatric residential center with a contract that was approved 18 months ago through a shell procurement process. Polk is in a similar facility in Wyoming. Both are listed as stable, non-communicative, long-term residential care. She absorbed that. Are their families aware? Families have been told they're in classified debriefing programs. The paperwork looks federal. It's not. Who's behind the procurement contracts? That's where it gets complicated. His voice dropped slightly, not from volume, but from the tone of someone stepping onto uncertain ground. There's a name that keeps coming up in the subsidiary chains. A company called Helix Meridian Consulting, defense adjacent, private, about 8 years old. On paper, they do healthcare management for veteran populations. In practice, he paused. We're still working on in practice. But 3 of the 4 senior partners have histories in classified military contracting, and at least one of them has a connection to a program that was shut down 6 years ago under circumstances that were never fully explained publicly. Claire looked at the mountains beyond the parking lot. What kind of program? She said. The kind where certain operators, after certain kinds of deployments, end up knowing things that create administrative inconvenience. He said it with the flatness of someone who had been in enough rooms to understand what administrative inconvenience actually meant. Whitmore, if this is what it looks like, I know. You need to be careful. I know that too. She watched a car pull out of the lot. I found something on the medication. The new prescription isn't legitimate. I have independent toxicology. Send it to the number I'll text you in the next hour, encrypted. How long before you can get this to someone who can act on it? Days, maybe a week? A pause. Can you hold that long? She thought about Devlin in room 14. She thought about Marcus Webb in a facility outside Butte, listed as non-communicative. She thought about the holding company 40 miles away, and Hatch in a kennel somewhere, and the 14 months that had apparently elapsed while this had been happening. I can hold, she said. She hung up. And then she went back into the hospital and did her rounds like someone who had just heard unremarkable news, because that was the only thing she knew how to be in a situation that required her to keep moving. On day 22, Peg Dolan stopped her in the medication room. Peg closed the door, which she had never done before. She was wearing the expression of someone who had spent a long time deciding whether to say something and had just resolved the decision. You're still pulling his charts, Peg said. Claire kept her face neutral. It's my assignment. Your assignment is the whole ward. You're spending more time on room 14 than on the rest of the floor combined, and people are noticing. She crossed her arms. Fitch notified Strand this morning. There's a formal review scheduled for Friday. 3 days. What kind of review? Performance? Scope of practice? They're going to say you've been practicing outside your license by conducting independent assessments. Peg's jaw was tight. Whitmore. I don't know what you found and I'm not asking, but if you have anything… She stopped, changed direction slightly. They're going to move the patient before the end of the week. Marsh. There's a transfer order pending to a long-term residential facility in Wyoming. Wyoming, the same state where Terrence Polk had disappeared. When was the order written? Claire said carefully. 2 days ago. It's not in the public file yet. Peg looked at her with an expression that was doing several things at once. I shouldn't have told you that. Then you didn't, Claire said. Peg looked at her for one more second, and something in that look was the closest thing to an apology for all the times she'd said, close your notebook and do your rounds, and then she uncrossed her arms and walked out. Claire stood in the medication room with her hands flat on the counter and ran the numbers. 3 days to a performance review, a transfer order already written, and a toxicology report sitting in an encrypted file that hadn't yet reached the people with the authority to do something about it. She went to the break room and took out her personal phone, not the prepaid, and wrote a message to the encrypted number she'd been given, forwarding the lab report with a timestamp notation in a single line, transfer order pending, 3-day window. Then she texted the prepaid and told it to check messages. The response came back in 4 minutes. Moving faster. Keep patient in facility. By any means within your license. She understood what that meant. It meant she had to find a clinical reason. Legitimate, documented, defensible, to flag Devlin Marsh as medically unfit for transfer, something that would require additional observation, additional workup, something that would slow the paper process long enough for whatever was being assembled on the other end to arrive. She had 3 days. She went back to Ward 4, and she thought about it very carefully while she finished her shift, and by 8 o'clock she had the beginning of a plan and the first edges of the kind of nervous focus that happened when you were operating in a situation where the margin for error was genuinely small. She stopped by room 14 on her way out. Devlin was awake. He'd been awake more than not these last few days. The sleep deprivation from losing Hatch was compounded now by whatever the falsified medication was doing to his chemistry, and he looked like a man who was working very hard to hold a specific kind of steady. "There's a transfer order," she said quietly. "Wyoming. End of the week." He didn't react the way she'd expected. No anger, no surprise. He nodded, slowly, like a man who had suspected something like this was coming and had already filed it somewhere internal. "Webb went to Wyoming," he said. "Yes." "Polk, too." "Yes." He looked at the window. "You know what they know." It wasn't quite a question, and she didn't quite answer it. "Get some sleep. I'm going to write a clinical observation flag tomorrow morning. It'll be documented." She paused. "Do you trust me?" He looked at her. It took a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I do." She left the ward and walked to the parking lot, and she was halfway to her car when she noticed it. The black SUV at the far end of the lot had been there when she'd arrived 11 hours ago. She'd registered it then as administrative, late meeting, nothing specific. But it was still there now, engine off, and when she'd walked past it, the subtle shift of a figure inside adjusting position, so small she would have missed it on any other night in any other part of her life, told her that someone was sitting in it, watching the entrance. She kept walking to her car. She didn't look back. She drove to the gas station, past it, and took 2 turns she didn't need to take before she was satisfied that the SUV hadn't followed her. Then she pulled over and called the prepaid. "There's surveillance on the hospital," she said the moment he picked up. "I know," said the voice on the other end. "Not ours." She sat with that for 2 seconds. "Then whose?" "We don't know yet." A pause that had weight to it. "Whitmore. How much does the patient know about why he's there? What he's carrying?" She thought about the way Devlin had said, "You know what they know." The way he'd said it like a statement of shared understanding rather than an accusation. "Enough. Then we need to accelerate. I'm making contact with a federal oversight team tonight, but I need something from you first, something physical, not just the toxicology." "What kind of something?" "Medication samples. Anything you can get that was administered to Marsh in the last week that didn't match the labeled prescription. Something we can put in front of a federal judge." Claire looked at the dark street outside her windshield. The medication she'd sent to the lab had been the tissue sample Devlin had saved. Trace amounts. Enough for analysis. Not enough for evidence that would hold in a legal proceeding. What the voice on the phone was asking for required her to get inside the hospital's medication supply chain and extract something that was documented, labeled, and directly traceable to Redstone's pharmacy. That was not a thing a probationary nurse could do without being caught. Unless she did it in the middle of a crisis, when nobody was watching the pharmacy cabinet. Unless she manufactured the crisis. "I can get it," she said. "Give me 36 hours. 36 hours. She hung up. She drove home. She sat at her kitchen table in the quiet of her apartment with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, and thought about the specific series of actions that would be required, and the specific things that could go wrong with each of them, and the specific difference between what she was considering and the several things it would be easy to confuse it with. She was not going to manufacture a patient crisis. That was the line, and she wasn't going to touch it. But Devlin Marsh had a documented history of post-seizure complications, and the falsified medication in his system was an active medical risk that she had independently verified, and if she documented, formally, in his official chart, the specific combination she'd identified and flagged it as a clinical emergency requiring immediate independent pharmaceutical review, the resulting lockdown on his medication supply would almost certainly require the pharmacy to pull the original dispensed vials for audit. It was the paperwork. It was always the paperwork. She opened her laptop and started writing the clinical flag in a draft document, choosing every word with the care of someone who understood that this language would eventually be read by people who were specifically looking for reasons to dismiss it. She was 3 paragraphs in when her phone buzzed. Not the prepaid. Her personal phone. Unknown number, but local area code. She picked it up. Silence on the other end for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Male, low, careful. Ms. Whitmore. You don't know me. A pause. But I work the night pharmacy window at Redstone, and I've been watching the same orders you've been watching. Claire set her coffee down. There's something you need to see, the voice said. Tonight, if you can get to the hospital within the next hour. She looked at the clock. It was 11:47 p.m. Why tonight, she said. Because Dr. Fitch is coming in at 6 a.m. tomorrow to pull the medication logs, all of them, the originals. The voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that she recognized as controlled fear. After that, there won't be anything left to find. She was in her car and moving before she finished the thought, not because she trusted the voice on the phone. She didn't, not automatically, not the way a different version of herself might have before she'd learned what trust cost in operational environments. She moved because the logic held regardless of motive. If someone inside Redstone's pharmacy had been watching the same medication anomalies she'd been tracking, they had either been sitting on that information out of fear or out of calculation, and either way, a call at 11:47 p.m. meant something had changed. Either they'd reached their limit of what they could stay quiet about, or someone had made a move that forced their hand. Both scenarios meant the window was closing faster than she'd thought. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her mind running parallel tracks. The call itself, the voice, the specific phrasing. Dr. Fitch is coming in at 6 a.m. tomorrow to pull the medication logs. All of them. The originals. Not unusual phrasing for someone panicking, but also exactly the kind of phrasing you'd use if you were trying to manufacture urgency in someone you needed to lure into a building at midnight. She parked 2 blocks from the hospital, not in the lot, and walked in through the side entrance that the overnight staff used, the one that required badge access but had no camera covering the approach from the west because the camera had been broken for 3 weeks and maintenance kept deferring the repair. She knew this because she'd been cataloging those details since day 5, the same way she'd cataloged exits and angles and behavioral patterns, because some training was too deep to override. The pharmacy window was at the end of the ground floor east corridor, behind a heavy counter with sliding glass panels that were locked after 10 p.m. The overnight pharmacist, the one who handled the emergency dispensing window and the after-hours documentation, was a heavy-set man in his 40s named Garrett Odom, and he was standing at the counter when she came around the corner, looking like someone who had made a decision he was still arguing with himself about. He looked up when he saw her. "You came," he said. The relief in his voice was specific, not theatrical, not manufactured. It was the sound of someone who'd been alone with something too long. "I came," she said. She stopped at the counter, kept her body sideways, old positioning habit. "Talk." He looked down the corridor both directions, then back at her. "I've been the overnight pharmacist here for 6 years. I know what the orders are supposed to look like. I know when something's off." He pushed a folder across the counter. "These are the dispensing logs for the last 4 months. All of the entries I've flagged are highlighted." She opened the folder. The highlighted entries ran to 3 pages. Not just Devlin Marsh. 7 other patients on Ward 4, all with service backgrounds, all with the same pattern. Medication substitutions in the first week of admission, dosage adjustments without corresponding physician notes, and in 4 cases, entries that had been modified after the fact. She could see the modification because Garrett Odom was meticulous in a way that most people in this building had apparently never noticed. He'd kept parallel copies, dated, with the original entries photographed before any changes appeared in the digital system. "These are your personal copies," she said. "Since month 3. He looked at her steadily. "I tried to report it through the pharmacy director 8 weeks ago. She told me the orders were correct and to stop creating unnecessary documentation trails." "Who is the pharmacy director?" "Sandra Kell. She was hired 14 months ago." He paused. "Right before the new Ward 4 intake protocols went into effect." 14 months, the same timestamp that kept appearing. "What do you know about Helix Meridian Consulting?" The change in his face was immediate. Not fear exactly, but the specific recognition of someone who'd heard a name in a context that confirmed something they'd hoped wasn't real. "They have a management contract with the hospital. I've seen the name on the procurement filings." "Have you seen it on the medication orders?" He hesitated. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a second folder, thinner, and pushed it across. This one I found 3 weeks ago. I wasn't going to show anyone. I have a wife, 2 kids. She understood that. She opened the folder. Inside was a single document, a supply authorization form, the kind used to approve non-formulary medications from external suppliers. The supplier listed was a pharmaceutical distributor she didn't recognize, but the authorization signature at the bottom wasn't from the pharmacy director or the hospital administrator. It was from Helix Meridian Consulting, LLC. A private consulting firm was authorizing controlled substance substitutions in a federal veterans medical center. She stood at the counter for a moment with the paper in her hand, making sure she was reading it correctly, running through the alternative explanations. There weren't any. A consulting firm did not have the authority to authorize medication orders. There was no regulatory framework under which this was legal, which meant this document was either the most damning piece of evidence she'd seen in 22 days at Redstone, or it was a fabrication designed to look like the most damning piece of evidence she'd seen in 22 days at Redstone. She took a photograph of it with the prepaid phone, then another from a different angle. "Do you have the original?" she said. "That is the original." He met her eyes. "I pulled it from the archive file 3 days ago when I realized Fitch was going to request a full audit purge. If he finds it's missing, he won't tonight." She photographed the dispensing logs, all 3 pages of highlights, systematically. "Garrett, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You cannot be here when this breaks open. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you're the kind of evidence they'll try to discredit first." "I'm not going anywhere. This is my job." "I know." She handed the folders back. "Keep the copies somewhere off this property. Do you have a lawyer?" "My brother-in-law." "Call him tomorrow morning, early. Tell him you have documents related to a federal investigation and you need protected counsel." She looked at him directly. "Don't tell anyone else. Not the pharmacy director, not your supervisor. Nobody." He nodded, slow and deliberate. She was turning to leave when he said, "There's one more thing." She stopped. "The transfer van," he said. "For Marsh." "It's not a VA transport." She turned back around. "I saw the paperwork when Kell filed the medication order for transfer sedation. The transport company isn't on the VA-approved vendor list. It's a private contractor." He paused. "The name on the contract is a subsidiary of Helix Meridian." She absorbed that. They weren't just going to move Devlin Marsh to Wyoming. They were going to move him in a vehicle they controlled, medicated with a protocol they'd designed, to a facility connected to the same company that had been managing his illegal medication substitution from the start. "What time is the transfer scheduled?" she said. "Thursday, 6 a.m. He looked at her. "Before the day shift comes on." 42 hours. She thanked him and walked back down the corridor and out through the side entrance, moving at a pace that was normal enough not to attract attention from the 2 people she passed. She got to her car and sat in it with the photographs loaded on the prepaid and her mind doing the fast, specific arithmetic of someone calculating resources against a timeline. She had 42 hours and a folder of photographs and a toxicology report and a retired contact who was assembling something federal on the other end of a phone line. And she needed all of it to move faster than she had originally planned because the transfer window had been compressed, and the surveillance in the parking lot was still unexplained, and at 6 a.m. Fitch was coming in to sanitize the pharmacy records. She sent the photographs to the encrypted number. Then she called the prepaid. It rang 5 times before he picked up. "I have new evidence," she said. "Photos, 12 images just sent, and I need you to tell me where the federal contact is in the process." A pause. The kind that meant he was looking at the photographs even as she spoke. "This is a Helix Meridian authorization on a controlled substance order." "Yes." "Whitmore, that's—" He stopped. Started again. "That's not a documentation violation. That's a federal crime. Minimum 3 statutes. And if those medications contributed to patient harm, we're into territory that requires a federal grand jury, not just an oversight complaint. The patient is being transferred Thursday at 6 a.m. Private contractor, Helix Meridian subsidiary." The silence on the other end was 4 seconds long, which in her experience of this particular man was the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. "The oversight contact I've been working with. She's a deputy inspector at the Defense Health Agency. I've been building toward a formal referral, but the timeline I was looking at was 2 weeks, not 40 hours. Then it needs to be 40 hours. I understand that. His voice had the flatness of someone reorganizing internal logistics in real time. Send me everything you have, all of it. The toxicology, the pharmacy logs, the Helix authorization, the transfer documentation. I'm going to need it in a single package. You'll have it by 3 a.m. And Whitmore, the surveillance vehicle at the hospital. If it's not ours and it's not local law enforcement, it's Helix, she said, or someone working for them. Then you need to assume you're being watched. I already assumed that. She hung up and drove home through the empty streets of Grover Falls and spent the next 3 hours at her kitchen table assembling a document package with the focused efficiency of someone who had been trained to produce operational briefs under time pressure. She was not fast because she was panicking. She was fast because she was clear, which was a different thing entirely. Clarity produced speed, panic produced errors, and she could not afford errors. She sent the package at 2:58 a.m. and then lay down on her couch with her jacket still on and closed her eyes for what she estimated was about 4 hours, which turned out to be 3 hours and 40 minutes, because her body woke her at 6:34 in the way it always did when she'd set an internal deadline. She was back at the hospital by 7:15. The morning was quiet in the specific way that meant something had already happened. She felt it as soon as she badged through the side entrance, a changed texture to the air of the building, the way a room feels after an argument has just ended. The overnight staff doing handoff briefings had the slightly too careful posture of people avoiding eye contact with something. She found out what when she reached the Ward 4 nursing station and saw the day shift charge nurse, a compact, efficient woman named Lori Baxter, on the phone with an expression that was 2 degrees tighter than normal. Peg Dolan was supposed to be on days this week. Peg wasn't there. Claire did the medication cart handoff with the overnight nurse and kept her face neutral and waited until Baxter was off the phone. "Where's Dolan?" she asked, conversationally, as if she barely cared. Baxter set the phone down. "Administrative leave, as of this morning." A pause that had edges. "Dr. Strand's office is doing a staffing review. Administrative leave." Peg, who had 11 years on this ward, who had told Claire about the transfer order and then looked at her with something that was as close to an apology as institutional loyalty allowed. They'd moved against Peg because Peg had talked to her. She went to room 14. Devlin was already awake, sitting in the chair by the window with the contained stillness of someone who had been managing their own anxiety for a long time and was getting close to the limit. He looked at her face when she came in. "They got to someone," he said. "Dolan? Administrative leave." His jaw tightened. "That's on me." "No, it isn't." She set the medication chart down on the bed. "I filed a formal clinical flag on your chart last night after I left. Documented concerns about medication interaction risk. It's in the system under my name with timestamps. It should delay the transfer paperwork." Should. She met his eyes. "It buys time. The federal contact is moving. I need another 30 hours. "Claire." He said her name for the first time. She noticed. "If they're putting Peg on administrative leave for talking to you, they know you're the one building the case." He looked at the door. "How long before they come after you directly?" She thought about Dr. Strand's office. She thought about the performance review scheduled for Friday, which was now 2 days away. She thought about the black SUV in the parking lot. "I've been expecting it." "That's not an answer." "I know." She picked the chart back up. "Take the medication when they bring it this morning. The same one as before. I need it to look like compliance." She paused. "Hold what you can." He looked at her steadily. "You've done this before. Not nursing." He said it without accusation, just the flat statement of someone who'd been trained to read people and had been reading her for 3 weeks. "Whatever you did before this, it was operational, wasn't it?" She didn't answer. She wrote a note in his chart and then looked up at him. "When I figure out the right moment to tell you, I will." He nodded once. "Fair enough." She left room 14, and 40 minutes later she was called to Dr. Strand's office. The performance review had been moved up. That was the first thing Strand said when Claire sat down. Not good morning, not any of the preceding pleasantries that Strand used as a management technique. Just, "We've moved your review to today, given recent events." "Peg Dolan's administrative leave?" Claire said. Strand looked at her with an expression that was precisely calibrated to contain nothing. "We're discussing your performance, Miss Whitmore." Dr. Fitch was there too, which she hadn't expected. seated to the left of Strand's desk in a chair that suggested he'd been invited rather than summoned, which told her the conversation had been planned in advance of this morning. He had a folder in front of him and the expression of someone who was prepared to be disappointed. "I want to talk about the clinical flag you entered this morning," Fitch said, "on the Marsh patient. I documented concerns about a medication interaction risk based on my direct observation of the patient over the last several weeks. The notation cites a potential adverse interaction between the current valproate and undocumented supplemental compounds. That's a serious allegation against a pharmacological order I personally authorized. It's a clinical observation, not an allegation." She kept her voice the same as it always was. "If the compounds are documented, the documentation would resolve the concern." Fitch glanced at Strand. Strand looked at Claire. "Miss Whitmore," Strand said, "the review we're conducting today concerns a pattern of behavior that exceeds your scope of practice as a probationary registered nurse. Specifically, conducting independent assessments outside your clinical role, making contact with pharmacy staff regarding medication protocols without physician authorization, and documenting in patient charts in ways that contradict and undermine physician orders." She set a paper on the desk and turned it to face Claire. "This is a notice of immediate suspension pending the completion of a formal review process." Claire looked at the paper. The timestamp at the top was 6:47 a.m. Fitch had come in before 7. Just as Garrett Odom had warned her, she looked at the paper for a moment and then looked at Strand. "This suspension, does it affect the transfer order on Devlin Marsh?" Strand's expression didn't change. "That's not something you need to be concerned with anymore. I entered a clinical flag this morning that identifies an active patient safety risk. Under federal nursing standards, a flagged safety concern requires review before—" "The flag has been reviewed," Fitch said, "and found to be without clinical basis." "Who reviewed it?" "I did." She looked at him. "You reviewed a flag documenting concerns about your own medication orders." "Miss Whitmore." Strand's voice dropped a half-degree in temperature. "Effective immediately, your badge access to Ward 4 is suspended. You may access the building only to retrieve your personal belongings. HR will contact you regarding the formal process." She folded her hands. "I want to be clear that this is an internal process, not a termination. We take the transfer vehicle on Thursday," Claire said. "Is it registered through Helix Meridian Consulting?" The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it in this office. Both Strand and Fitch went very still in the specific way of people who have just heard something they did not expect to hear in this room. "I'm not familiar with that company," Strand said after a beat too long. "I think you are," Claire said. She stood up, picked up her bag, and looked at both of them with the same level expression she'd maintained since she walked in. "I'm going to collect my things." She walked out. In the elevator, she sent a single text to the prepaid, "Suspended, moving timeline up. Need federal contact active by Thursday, 0500. The response came before she reached the ward. "Understood, do not leave the city." She cleaned out her locker with her hands moving steadily, and her mind already passed this room and on to the next problem. She had her notebooks. The second one she retrieved from the car, the first from the locker. She had the photographs on the prepaid. She had the toxicology report. She had Garrett Odom's copies of the pharmacy logs, currently stored somewhere off hospital property, and a retired contact running a parallel operation she didn't have full visibility into. What she didn't have was a way to stay inside this building. She was walking back through the ground floor toward the exit when her phone buzzed. The prepaid. A number she didn't recognize. She stepped into a side alcove and answered it. "Miss Whitmore?" A woman's voice, precise, measured, with the clipped efficiency of someone who communicated for a living and didn't waste words doing it. "My name is Renata Voss. I'm a deputy inspector with the Defense Health Agency, Office of Investigations. I understand you've been in contact with a mutual acquaintance." Claire's breathing stayed even. "Yes. I've reviewed the package you sent, all of it." A brief pause. "I need to ask you some questions about your previous service record before we go further." My service record is sealed." "I know. I've already filed the appropriate clearance request." Another pause, this one more deliberate. "Miss Whitmore, I've been working on Helix Meridian Consulting for 11 months. What you've given me in the last 6 hours has moved this investigation further than 11 months of separate work." Her voice remained level, but something underneath it shifted, the way voices did when information was being reassessed in real time. I need to know. The clinical flag you filed on Marsh this morning, can it withstand a physician challenge? Long enough, Claire said. 72 hours, maybe less. I need 48. A pause. Can you get back into that building? I just had my badge suspended. I'm aware. I'm asking whether there's another way. Claire looked at the hospital entrance from the alcove. She thought about Ward 4, about Room 14, about a man with 2 decades of service who was sleeping in 2-hour increments because they'd taken the one thing that helped him rest. She thought about Marcus Webb in a facility outside Butte listed as non-communicative. She thought about whatever was sitting in Garrett Odom's off-site storage that she hadn't fully cataloged yet. There might be, she said. I'm going to need you available by phone at all hours between now and Thursday morning. Understood. One more thing. Voss's voice changed register slightly. Not warmer, but more direct. The surveillance vehicle outside Redstone Medical Center. We flagged it at EO 300 last night. It's registered to a security firm with a documented relationship to Helix Meridian. A pause. They know you filed the federal flag, not the clinical one, the other one, through our mutual contact. Something cold moved through Claire's chest. How? We don't know yet, which means you should operate as though everything you do from this moment is visible. Voss paused. Ms. Whitmore, are you prepared to do that? She thought about the word prepared. She thought about what it meant in the context of what was happening and what had already happened and what was likely to happen in the next 48 hours. Yes, she said. Then stay available. We'll be in contact. The call ended. Claire stood in the alcove for 3 seconds. Then she walked out through the main entrance into the daylight and stood on the front steps of Redstone Veterans Medical Center for a moment before she started walking to her car. Across the lot, at its far edge, the black SUV was back. She didn't look at it. She drove to the gas station, bought water, and sat in the lot for 20 minutes running through everything she knew about the layout of Redstone's ground floor. The side entrance with the broken camera. The maintenance corridor that connected the parking structure to the east wing. The pharmacy window and Garrett Odom, and the fact that she still had her personal nursing credentials even if her badge access was suspended. She needed one more thing from inside that building. Not documents, not photographs. She needed Devlin Marsh's official chart to contain a notation, legitimate, clinically defensible, written by a licensed physician, that flagged him as medically unfit for transport, something that required verification before any transfer could proceed. Her own flag had been reviewed and dismissed in under an hour. She needed one that couldn't be dismissed the same way. She needed Anita Vasquez. She called the neurology department's direct line, not the main hospital number, and asked for Dr. Vasquez by name. The receptionist said she was in clinic until noon. It was 9:47 a.m. Claire drove to a diner 2 blocks north and ordered coffee she didn't want, and sat in a corner booth and worked through the plan, testing it the way she always tested plans. Not for the way it was supposed to go, but for the ways it could fail. At 11:55, she called the neurology line again. Vasquez picked up herself. Dr. Vasquez, this is Claire Whitmore. I was a nurse on Ward 4 until this morning. A brief pause. I remember you, the seizure response in the OT room. Yes, I need 5 minutes. Not on this phone, but the hospital line is logged. I'm at a diner on Carver Street, the one with the green sign. Can you come at noon? A silence that lasted long enough for Claire to count her own pulse. Give me 15 minutes, Vasquez said. She arrived in 12, sliding into the booth across from Claire with her white coat folded over her arm and the expression of someone who had been thinking since the phone call ended. She was somewhere in her early 40s, with the specific tired precision of a clinician who had spent years navigating the gap between what was medically correct and what was institutionally permitted. Claire put the toxicology report on the table. Vasquez looked at it for a long time. Where did this come from? She said quietly. Independent lab. Billings. The sample was from Devlin Marsh's current medication protocol. Claire kept her voice low. What you're looking at is not the labeled compound. It's a combination that at sustained therapeutic doses produces... I can read it, Vasquez said, still looking at the report. Her voice had gone to the careful neutral of someone controlling a reaction. This is a chronic impairment protocol, not treatment. She looked up. This is designed to make him appear consistently unstable. Yes, Vasquez set the report down. He's being transferred Thursday. 6 a.m., private transport, Helix Meridian subsidiary. Something moved across Vasquez's face that Claire recognized. The specific expression of a person who has just been given a piece of information that resolves a question they'd been carrying and doesn't like the answer. 14 months ago, I flagged an unusual post-seizure presentation in another Ward 4 patient. The patient was transferred before I could complete my neurological workup. She paused. I was told the transfer was medically appropriate. Who told you that? Fitch. She said it flatly. Claire looked at her. I need you to make an official notation in Devlin Marsh's neurological record. A documented concern requiring verification before transport. Something that puts a clinical hold on the transfer that cannot be resolved by Fitch alone. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. If I do that, I'm putting my department in direct conflict with a senior physician. If you don't, Claire said, a man with 20 years of service and a documented neurological event gets into a private vehicle at 6 a.m. Thursday morning, medicated with a protocol you've just read, and ends up in a facility 2 states away where his family has no access and his records disappear. She paused. I think you know what happens after that. Vasquez looked at the toxicology report for a long time. Then she looked at Claire. I need to make a phone call first, she said, to the hospital's legal counsel. Don't use the hospital line. Vasquez pulled out her personal phone without being told. Claire waited, watching the diner entrance and the street outside and the way the light was sitting on the buildings in the late morning. She was on her 3rd hour of running on 4 hours of sleep, and she could feel the edges of it, the specific way exhaustion started to slow the connections between observations and conclusions. And she let herself drink the coffee she hadn't wanted, because caffeine was a tool like any other. Vasquez was on the phone for 7 minutes. When she hung up, she looked at Claire with an expression that had settled into something resolute. I'm going back to the hospital, she said. I'm going to request an independent neurological consultation on Marsh's case and enter a documented hold pending that consultation. She picked up the toxicology report. Can I keep this? That's a copy. It wasn't, but it would be. Yes. Vasquez stood up, folded the report carefully, and slid it into the pocket of her white coat. Whitmore. She paused. Who was the other patient? 14 months ago, the one I flagged. Marcus Webb, Claire said, former special operations. He's currently in a residential facility outside Butte listed as non-communicative. Vasquez absorbed that in silence. Then she picked up her coat and left the diner without another word, moving with the particular purposefulness of someone who has decided to do a thing that they have been avoiding and is now resolved. Claire sat with her empty coffee cup and waited for the door to close behind her. Then she looked at the window, at the street outside, and saw a sedan she didn't recognize parked 40 yards east with 2 occupants who had stopped watching the diner entrance slightly too late. Not the SUV. A different vehicle. They were multiplying their surveillance, which meant they knew the situation was accelerating, which meant that whatever Helix Meridian had in motion, it was now moving in direct response to what she'd filed with the federal contact, and she was out of time to be careful in the ways she'd been careful. She texted Renata Voss. Under physical surveillance, 2 vehicles confirmed. Neurological hold being filed on Marsh within the hour. The response came in 90 seconds. Confirmed. Federal response activating. Do not contact the hospital. Stay mobile. She left $3 on the table and went out through the diner's back entrance, the one that opened onto the alley, and walked 2 blocks east before circling back to her car. She had less than 40 hours. She drove to Garrett Odom's address. She'd gotten it from the staff directory 2 days ago in a moment of foresight that now felt like the most important thing she'd done, and knocked on his door at 12:40 p.m. His wife answered. He was behind her in 30 seconds, and his face when he saw Claire was the face of a man who had been waiting for this knock and was only partially surprised it came today. They accessed the pharmacy archive this morning, he said before she could speak. The originals I flagged are gone from the system. Do you still have your copies? He glanced at his wife, who was watching them both. Yes. I need them. Right now. She paused. And I need you to call your brother-in-law. He turned to his wife. She looked at Claire for a moment, really looked at her, the evaluating look of someone deciding whether to be afraid. And then she said to Garrett, Go get them. He got them. Claire drove away from the Odom house with a folder of pharmacy documentation on the passenger seat and the prepaid phone running a background transfer of everything she'd sent to the encrypted address, and she was 3 blocks away when Voss called. "We have a problem," Voss said. Claire tightened her grip on the wheel. "The federal warrant package. We submitted it to the district court at 0800 this morning. Duty judge signed it at 10. Voss's voice was level, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "It was leaked to Helix Meridian's legal team. We don't know how yet, but they filed an emergency motion to delay execution pending a jurisdictional challenge." "How long does the challenge buy them?" "Standard motion, 48 hours minimum, which pushes us past the transfer window." A pause. "They're moving the transfer up, Whitmore. Our contact inside the hospital says the new time is tomorrow morning, not Thursday, Wednesday, 4 a.m. Claire looked at the clock on her dashboard. It was 1:14 p.m., 15 hours. "Tell me you have something that can move faster than a court motion," she said. "There's one mechanism," Voss said, "but it requires the patient's direct testimony. A sworn voluntary statement from Devlin Marsh about what he knows, what he was carrying, what the classified program involved, why these men are being systematically silenced. With that, I can go to a different judge under national security statutes and get an emergency protective order that supersedes the jurisdictional challenge. He's in a locked psychiatric ward." "I know." Another pause. "Can you get to him?" 15 hours. A suspended badge, 2 surveillance vehicles, a building she'd been formally removed from. She looked at the road ahead of her and thought about the maintenance corridor between the parking structure and the east wing, about the broken camera on the side entrance, about a man sitting in a chair by a window, waiting for someone willing to understand instead of judge. "Yes," she said. She was already turning the car around. The maintenance corridor smelled like rust and recycled air and the specific institutional neglect of spaces nobody was meant to spend time in. Claire had mapped it mentally on day 6. A habit, the way cataloging exits was a habit, the way noticing the broken camera had been a habit. And she moved through it now with her jacket collar up and her head down and the folder of Odom's pharmacy documents in her bag, walking at the pace of someone who belongs somewhere rather than the pace of someone sneaking, because the difference was visible and the corridor had 2 ceiling-mounted units she couldn't confirm were inactive. The east wing connection put her out on the ground floor, 40 feet from the stairwell, on the opposite end of the building from the main entrance and the security desk. It was 2:31 p.m. The day shift was in full swing, which was both a problem and not. More people meant more movement, meant less individual scrutiny, as long as she moved like she had somewhere to be. She went up the stairs. Ward 4 smelled the same as it always had, industrial cleaner and stale air. And underneath both of them, something older, the accumulated weight of people who were struggling in a place not designed for struggling. She came through the stairwell door and turned left, away from the nursing station, and walked directly to room 14 with the unhurried stride of someone who had done this 100 times. Devlin was on his feet when she pushed the door open, standing by the window with his arms crossed, and when he saw her, his expression went through 3 things in rapid succession: relief, surprise, and then the sharp focus of someone recalibrating a situation. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "I'm aware." She closed the door and moved to the window, positioning herself where the hallway camera's angle wouldn't catch her. "I have about 8 minutes before someone checks this room. I need you to listen." She told him all of it. Not slowly, not carefully, fast and complete, the way you briefed someone who had the training to absorb operational information quickly and didn't need things explained twice. The federal investigation, Renata Voss, the warrant and the jurisdictional challenge, the moved-up transfer at 4 a.m., what she needed from him, and why. He didn't interrupt once. When she finished, he stood with his arms still crossed and his jaw tight and his eyes doing the thing they did when he was running internal calculations. She gave him the silence to do it. "A sworn statement," he said finally, "about the program. About what you know, what you were carrying when they admitted you here. Why someone with a consulting contract and a medication protocol would want you non-communicative for the next several years." He exhaled through his nose. "The program was called Criterion. It was officially discontinued 6 years ago." He looked at the window. Except it wasn't. Discontinued means the funding changes hands and the documentation gets reclassified and the people who ran it find private sector cover. He paused. I found out because one of my guys, Webb, came to me 8 months before I ended up here. He'd been approached. Someone from Helix Meridian, though we didn't know the name then, offering money for silence about specific operational details from a deployment in 2019. What kind of operational details? The kind that would be very inconvenient for certain contractors if they became public. He met her eyes. The kind that involved civilian targeting authorization, which is a war crime by any definition, which certain people signed off on under the cover of a classified program that officially doesn't exist. She looked at him for a moment. Webb said no. Webb said no. Polk said no. I said no. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, the same thing that had been underneath it from the beginning that she'd read as combat stress and now understood more completely. And then one by one we started ending up in places like this. 8 minutes were up. She didn't have more time for the full weight of what he was telling her, which was something she would have to carry later, in a different room, when the immediate problem was resolved. Right now it was evidence, and she needed it in a form that could go in front of a federal judge before 4 a.m. I need a written statement. Whatever you can give me about Criterion, the approach, the connection to Helix Meridian, specific enough to establish materiality. She pulled a folded set of blank paper from her bag. She'd thought of this in the car. And a pen. Now, if you can, he looked at the paper. You know what this does, he said. If I write this and something goes wrong, I know. She held his gaze. I also know what happens at 4 a.m. if you don't. He took the paper and the pen and sat down at the edge of the bed and started writing. She watched the door and the window and the corridor through the small rectangular window in the door's upper half, tracking the movement patterns of the staff. Baxter at the nursing station, a float nurse she didn't know, moving the medication cart south toward the far end of the ward, no one currently heading this direction. He wrote for 6 minutes. His handwriting was compact and precise, the kind that came from years of filling out military documentation in conditions that didn't allow for legibility problems. When he handed the pages back, she scanned them quickly, not reading for content yet, reading for what a federal judge would see. Names, dates, specific operational references. She didn't have the clearance to fully decode, but which would mean something to the right people. And the Helix Meridian approach, described in Devlin's flat, factual language, with the name of the man who'd made contact and the specific dollar figure offered and the date of the conversation. It was enough. Possibly more than enough. This is good, she said, and meant it as a technical assessment, not a compliment. Don't let them get Webb and Polk back, he said. It was the most direct personal thing he'd said to her in 3 weeks, and she understood it for what it was. Not a plea, because men like him didn't structure requests that way, but a statement of what mattered. I won't, she said. She folded the pages into her bag and went back out the door the same way she'd come in, moving at the same unremarkable pace, and she was halfway down the corridor when she heard Lori Baxter's voice from behind her. Miss Whitmore. She stopped, turned. Baxter was standing 15 feet away with an expression that contained something complicated. Not quite accusation, not quite confusion, and underneath both of those something else that she couldn't read immediately. You're suspended, Baxter said. I came back for personal items, Claire said. I thought I had everything this morning. They looked at each other for a moment. Baxter was a smart woman, smarter than Strand had probably accounted for when she'd assigned her to cover Peg Dolan's shift. And something was moving behind her eyes that was working through the available explanations and their relative plausibility. You were in room 14, Baxter said. Not a question. I was saying goodbye to a patient, Claire said. Another silence. Baxter looked at her for a long, assessing moment, and then she said very quietly, The transfer time changed. They put it on the board this morning, 4 a.m. She paused. I don't know why it changed. And nobody's explaining it. Claire looked at her steadily. I know you're not supposed to be here, Baxter said. I didn't see you. She turned and walked back toward the nursing station. Claire went down the stairs and through the maintenance corridor and out the side entrance and back to her car, and she sat in it for 45 seconds, letting her heartbeat normalize before she drove. She sent the pages to Voss via the encrypted channel, photographed, high resolution, all three, and wrote, "Sworn statement from Marsh, criterion, names, dates, helix, meridian contact, should meet materiality threshold." The response came in 4 minutes. Confirmed receipt. Filing for emergency protective order under National Security Statute now. Estimated 2 hours for judicial response. Do not move Marsh under any circumstances. 2 hours. It was 3:09 p.m. She drove to the far side of the hospital parking lot, engine running, watching the building's entrances, and she did the thing she'd always been bad at, which was waiting. The judge signed the emergency protective order at 5:44 p.m. Voss called her 40 seconds later. Marsh is under federal protective status, effective immediately. The order also names Marcus Webb and Terrence Polk as subjects of the same protection that extends to their current residential facilities. Voss's voice was still the same measured instrument it always was, but something in it had opened slightly, the specific release of someone who has been working toward a single point for a very long time. And we have simultaneous arrest warrants for 5 individuals: Strand, Fitch, Sandra Kell, 2 Helix Meridian principals named in Marsh's statement. Claire looked at the hospital entrance. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow morning. We want the operational team in position tonight, quietly. Warrants execute at 6 a.m., after the transfer window closes, so they can't use the chaos as cover to move Marsh before we have the building secured." A pause. "Whitmore, I need you to stay away from the hospital tonight, completely away. The surveillance vehicles are still active and we don't want a confrontation before the team is in position." "Understood. Get some sleep." She almost said something to that. Instead, she said, "What about Hatch? Marsh's service dog. He's at a private boarding facility 40 miles out." A brief silence. "Send me the address." She sent it. She drove to her apartment and sat in her kitchen for 20 minutes doing nothing in particular, which was harder than it should have been. Then she ate something. Toast, lukewarm soup from a can, nothing she tasted, and lay down on the couch with her jacket on again and closed her eyes. She didn't sleep well. She hadn't expected to. At 5:47 a.m. on Wednesday, before the sun had done anything more than suggest itself at the eastern edge of the Montana sky, 3 black SUVs entered the Redstone Veterans Medical Center parking lot from different directions and stopped in positions that covered the main entrance, the service entrance, and the ambulance bay. Claire was watching from her car, parked on the street outside the lot's perimeter, exactly where Voss had told her not to be. She wasn't going in. She just needed to see it. 8 people came out of the vehicles. Federal agents, she could tell by the bearing and the way they moved, the specific economy of people who were not putting on a show. 2 of them went directly to the security desk. The others split toward the administrative wing and the medical staff corridor with the purposeful efficiency of a team that had rehearsed this building's layout from blueprints. She watched the entrance. At 6:03, Dr. Roland Fitch arrived for his early morning access to the pharmacy records, drove into the lot, and parked in his usual spot near the administrative entrance. He was halfway to the door when 2 federal agents stepped out to meet him. She watched him stop, watched the agents show him the warrant, watched his posture go through the specific transformation of a man who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told it's over, except it's not going the direction he'd planned. At 6:19, a Montana State Police unit pulled up at the administrative entrance, which meant the arrest warrants were being executed in coordination with local law. The federal team had done this correctly, with every jurisdictional handshake in place. She could see movement in the administrative wing's second-floor windows. At 6:31, Dr. Meredith Strand was escorted out the main entrance in the company of 2 federal agents and a state police officer, and Claire watched her cross the parking lot with the stiff, minimized movements of someone who was managing their own shock in public and not managing it particularly well. Strand had always carried herself with the self-possession of someone who understood that authority was partly a performance, and now the performance had come apart in a hospital parking lot in front of the early morning staff arriving for the day shift, and there was nothing left to perform. Sandra Kell came out 11 minutes later. Then a third person she didn't immediately recognize, one of the Helix Meridian principals, she assumed, someone who'd been in the building for reasons she'd find out later. She watched all of it and felt something she didn't quite have a word for. Not satisfaction, exactly. That required a simpler relationship to the outcome than she had. more like the specific relief of a load-bearing calculation that had held. The structure was standing. Her phone buzzed. Voss. Building is secure. Marsh has been formally removed from the transfer list and placed under federal medical oversight pending independent clinical review. A brief pause. The facilities in Butte and Wyoming, we executed simultaneous entries at 6 a.m. Webb and Polk are both being transferred to VA facilities under federal protective status. Claire breathed out once. Hatch? She said. Retrieved at 0530. The handler is en route to the hospital. Another pause. Marsh doesn't know yet. She sat in her car and looked at the hospital entrance and thought about telling him. About the way he'd said the dog's name in the aftermath of the seizure, Hatch, stripped down to the thing that mattered when everything else had been taken away. I'd like to tell him, she said. That's your call, Voss said. We have a federal agent with him now. I'll let them know you're coming. A pause. Ms. Whitmore, use the main entrance this time. Ward 4 looked different with a federal agent standing outside room 14. The ward itself was the same. Same linoleum, same fluorescent light, same smell. But the staff moved differently through it, with the slightly careful quality of people who were still absorbing what had happened in the last 90 minutes and hadn't yet decided how to integrate it. Lori Baxter was at the nursing station. She looked at Claire when she came through the ward doors and said nothing, but something in her expression adjusted, a small recalibration of the way she'd been holding herself. And she nodded once, which was enough. The federal agent outside room 14 checked her ID and let her through. Devlin was sitting in the chair by the window. He looked like he'd been awake all night, which he probably had, and he looked like a man who had been told something significant within the last hour and was still processing it, which he probably also had. His hands were open on his knees. He looked up when she came in. They told me, he said. Which part? Most of it, I think. He looked at the window. The early morning light was doing something in the room that wasn't quite warm but was better than the institutional fluorescent. Webb, Polk. Simultaneous, 6 a.m. She sat down in the second chair. Independent medical review before any further treatment decisions. Federal protective status. He nodded, slow. Criterion? That's above my clearance. But the people who need to know what you wrote in that statement have it. She paused. The legal process is going to take time. The Helix Meridian principles will have lawyers, and the jurisdictional complexity is real. But the warrant package is federal, the evidence is documented by multiple independent sources, and the pharmacy records, what's left of them, and what Odom preserved, are in federal custody now. He was quiet for a moment. Fitch. Arrested this morning, Strand, Kell, 2 others. Good. He said it without energy, not because he didn't mean it, but because there was nothing triumphant about it. It was the flatness of a man who understood that consequences were necessary and correct, and didn't fix what had already happened. She let the quiet sit for a moment. Then she said, There's a vehicle coming up the access road in about 4 minutes. He looked at her. She watched his face when the handler came through the ward with Hatch on a lead. A compact, dark-coated Belgian Malinois with the alert, precise carriage of a working dog and the specific recognition behavior, a full-body shift of attention and purpose, that happened the moment the dog processed the scent of the person he was trained for. Devlin was out of the chair before she'd finished the thought, crossing the room, and Hatch came the last 6 feet at something just below a full run and hit his handler's hands and chest with the focused intensity of an animal that had been doing its job without its primary person and was now, finally, back in the configuration it was built for. Devlin went down to one knee on the hospital room floor. Not gracefully, not the way it would happen in a movie. And his face did something that Claire looked away from, because some things were not meant to have witnesses. She looked at the window. Outside, the Montana morning was getting fully underway, the sky doing its slow thing with light and distance. She could see the edge of the parking lot from here, the space where the black SUVs had been, now mostly cleared. Normal traffic coming and going. She gave him 3 full minutes. When she looked back, Hatch was sitting at his feet with the dog's shoulder pressed against his knee, and Devlin's hand was on the animal's head, and his face was composed again in the way it was always composed. Not shut down, just held together by the years of training that had made him able to function in environments that would have taken other people apart. He looked at her. Thank you, he said. Just that. She nodded. You should have told me, he said, earlier, what you were. It wasn't relevant. It was relevant to me. He looked down at Hatch. I spent 11 days in this room thinking I was the only person in it who'd been trained to see what was actually happening. She thought about that for a moment. You weren't. A federal agent knocked on the door and looked in. Ms. Whitmore, Deputy Inspector Voss is asking for you. Ground floor. She stood, looked at Devlin once more. Independent clinical review starts today. Real one, with doctors who don't have a contract with anyone. She paused. The valproate gets corrected. The lithium protocol your actual physician prescribed gets restored. He nodded. And then? And then you get better. She said it plainly, without inflation. Which takes time. But you've got time now. She followed the agent to the door and had her hand on the frame when he said, What you did before nursing? How long? She looked back. 8 years. Combat? Some of it. He was quiet for a moment. That's why you knew, he said. In the hallway, at ease. He met her eyes. Another nurse would have said calm down. She thought about that first morning, the tray against the wall, the sound from room 14, the 2 words that had come out of her without planning, from a register she carried whether she meant to or not. Yeah, she said. I guess so. She left Ward 4 and went down to the ground floor. Renata Voss was not what Claire had expected, which was a thought she recognized as irrational. She'd had no visual expectation, only a voice on a phone. But the woman waiting for her near the main entrance was somewhere in her mid-50s, with the kind of deliberately unremarkable appearance that people who did investigative work for a living sometimes cultivated, gray-streaked haircut practically, and a suit that was good quality but not memorable. She had the posture of someone who had been doing this for a long time and had stopped needing to look like she was doing it. She held out a hand when Claire reached her. They shook hands. You look like you haven't slept, Voss said. I had 4 hours. I had 3. She looked at Claire with an evaluating directness that was not unfriendly. I've read your service record, the unclassified portions. There isn't much unclassified. No. A pause. You were deployed in the same theater as the 2019 operation that Criterion was documenting. Yes. Did you know about the civilian targeting authorization? Claire looked at her steadily. Not until last night. Voss held her gaze for a moment. We're going to need your testimony as part of the federal proceeding, not about the military operation. That's a separate jurisdiction and a separate timeline. About the hospital, the medication, what you observed and documented. She paused. Are you prepared to do that? Yes. It's going to be complicated for you professionally. Redstone will almost certainly challenge the legitimacy of your clinical documentation, the independent assessment concern, scope of practice. I know. The nursing board may open an inquiry. I know that too. Claire looked at the main entrance, the morning light coming through the glass doors. I documented everything in real time. Every chart notation is time-stamped. The toxicology was independent. The pharmacy records are Odom's copies with provenance. If the nursing board wants to review my clinical judgment, they can review my clinical judgment. Voss looked at her for a moment. You're not worried. I'm worried about a lot of things, Claire said. The nursing board isn't one of them. Something shifted in Voss's expression. The specific shift of a person revising a previous assessment upward, which was different from being impressed and more like being corrected. There's one more thing, Voss said. The surveillance vehicles, the ones watching the hospital and following you. She paused. We pulled the registration chain this morning. The security firm that owns them has a subsidiary structure that goes through Helix Meridian, but the terminal ownership, the entity that contracted them, is a name that's going to complicate this case significantly. Claire waited. Brigadier General Wallace Oren, Voss said. Retired. He was the commanding officer of the unit that ran Criterion. She looked at Voss. He's been active in the cover-up, she said. More than active. Voss looked at her steadily. He's been directing it, which means this case is no longer just about Helix Meridian and a corrupt hospital. It reaches into flag-level military command. She paused. Which means it's about to get significantly more complicated and significantly more contested, and she looked at Claire with an expression that was completely level. Which means that you are about to become a material federal witness in a case that certain people with significant resources are going to work very hard to undermine. Claire stood in the lobby of the hospital she'd been suspended from the previous morning and looked at the federal investigator who had just told her that the shape of the problem was larger than either of them had known 36 hours ago. "How much larger?" she said. Voss reached into the bag over her shoulder and handed her a folder. Inside was a single document, a personnel roster from a classified program, dated 2019. The header read, Criterion, Operational Oversight Command. Wallace Oren's name was at the top. 2 lines below it was a name she recognized from a completely different context. Not military, not medical. Political. A name attached to a current federal appointment, a position of significant authority over veterans' healthcare policy at the national level. She looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked at Voss. "This goes further than the hospital," Claire said. "Much further," Voss said. "Which is why I need to ask you something directly." She met Claire's eyes. "Are you in? All the way in? Because once I file this level of the case, there's no version of this where you step back to being a quiet RN on a night shift somewhere." Claire looked at the document in her hand. She thought about Devlin in the room upstairs with his hand on Hatch's head and his face doing that thing she'd looked away from. She thought about Marcus Webb in a facility outside Butte, listed as non-communicative. She thought about Terrence Polk in Wyoming. She thought about the roster in her hand and the name 2 lines below Wallace Oren. She handed the folder back. "I'm in," she said. Voss took it and said nothing immediately, the way people who'd been doing this work for a long time processed a commitment. Not with enthusiasm, but with the specific gravity of someone who understood what it cost. Then she said, "Good, because we found a 4th name." Claire looked at her. "A 4th Special Operations veteran, not at Redstone. Different facility, different state, different mechanism." Voss held her gaze. "He's been under for 14 months, and nobody outside this investigation knows he's there." The 4th name was Sergeant First Class Joel Pruitt. Voss gave her the file in the car, not the hospital lobby, not anywhere with foot traffic or ceiling cameras. A plain manila folder with a federal evidence tag on the front that meant it had already been entered into the case record. Claire sat in the passenger seat of Voss's vehicle in the Redstone parking lot and read it while the morning finished arriving outside the windshield. Pruitt had been 37 when he disappeared from his family's awareness 14 months ago. His wife had been told he'd entered a voluntary residential program for combat-related PTSD in Nevada, which was partially true in the way that certain lies were built on the skeleton of a fact. There was a facility in Nevada, and he was in it, and it had the word residential in its name. Beyond that, the resemblance to truth ended. No voluntary admission documentation, no family contact rights preserved, no independent clinical oversight. His wife had made 11 calls to the VA in 14 months and been told 11 different versions of the same non-answer. She'd also hired a private attorney 6 weeks ago, which was how Voss had found the thread. "His wife," Claire said. "Diane Pruitt. She's been fighting this without knowing what she was fighting." Voss had both hands on the wheel even though the car wasn't moving. An old habit, maybe. She knew something was wrong from the beginning. The paperwork didn't look right to her. She's not in any medical field. She's a high school history teacher in Reno. But she kept saying the documents felt like they'd been written by someone who'd never met her husband. Because they had been. Because they had been. Voss looked at the hospital entrance. "We executed the Nevada facility this morning. Same 6 a.m. window. Pruitt is being transferred to VA care today." "What's his condition?" A pause that told her something before the words did. 14 months of the same medication protocol Marsh was on, possibly longer sustained exposure. Voss's voice stayed level in the specific way of someone reporting clinical facts that they are not allowing themselves to feel yet. "He's communicative, oriented to person. Time and place are inconsistent. Cognitive impairment. 14 months of a compound designed to keep a man's mind from functioning clearly in a facility where no one who loved him could see what was happening." Claire closed the folder. "Oren," she said. "Oren directed the Nevada placement and the Redstone placements. We have communication records, internal Helix Meridian emails that their legal team missed when they were doing their pre-warrant cleanup because they were on a server registered to a subsidiary 3 layers removed from the main company." Voss finally took her hands off the wheel. He had operational control of the cover-up. The Helix Meridian principals were executing it. Strand and Fitch were the institutional cover inside Redstone specifically, and the name below Oren on the Criterion roster. Deputy Administrator Carl Hendricks of the Office of Veterans Healthcare Policy. Voss said it with the flatness of someone who had been sitting with a piece of information long enough that the shock of it had worn off and left only the weight. He's been in that position for 3 years. He has oversight authority over VA facility standards and contracting, which is how Helix Meridian got its management contracts at 4 different VA-adjacent facilities without triggering a competitive bidding review. 4 facilities. Not just Redstone. Claire looked at the folder in her lap and thought about the scale of it. Not the abstraction of scale, but the specific human content of it. Men who had served in places the government still didn't officially acknowledge, who had come back carrying information that someone with authority and resources had decided was more dangerous than the men themselves were valuable. Processed through a system designed to look like care. "When do you move on, Oren?" she said. Federal arrest warrant was filed at 7 this morning. He's in Virginia. FBI field office is executing. A pause. Hendricks is more complicated. A sitting federal official requires a different procedural chain. Department of Justice has it now. How long? Days. Maybe a week. The evidence package is complete. The Criterion roster with his signature, the contracting irregularities, the Helix Meridian communication chain. The legal process is the legal process. Claire nodded. She understood the distinction between having enough to act and having acted. The space between them was where cases lived for months or years while lawyers argued procedure. And she'd been in that space before in different contexts and knew that impatience didn't compress it. "What do you need from me today?" she said. "Today? Nothing. Go home. Sleep." Voss looked at her directly. "I mean that as a practical instruction, not a courtesy. You've been running on insufficient sleep for days, and the deposition process starts in 72 hours. I need your memory precise." "My memory is precise." "I know. Keep it that way." A brief pause. "There's one more thing. The nursing board inquiry. Redstone's administration filed a complaint against your license this morning. Preemptive, almost certainly coordinated to undermine your credibility as a witness." Claire had expected this. She'd said as much to Voss the previous day. "What's the basis?" "Practicing outside scope. Independent assessment without physician authorization. Accessing patient records beyond your assigned caseload." Voss paused. "All of which you did." "All of which I did," Claire agreed. "And all of which is documented with clinical rationale time-stamped and contextualized by a medication falsification conspiracy that is now a federal criminal case." She looked at the hospital. "I'll get a lawyer. The federal government will provide one for the aspects that intersect with the case. For the licensing matter specifically, you'll want independent counsel." Voss reached into her bag and produced a business card. "This attorney has handled 3 similar whistleblower licensing cases. She's good." Claire took the card. She looked at the hospital one more time, the building she'd walked into 6 weeks ago as a per diem nurse with a 2-year employment gap and a deliberately unremarkable application, and which she was now looking at from a federal vehicle in a parking lot full of consequences. "Go home, Whitmore," Voss said, not unkindly. She went home. She slept for 9 hours, which was more than she'd slept at a stretch in 3 weeks. And when she woke up, it was dark outside, and her phone had 14 messages she went through systematically. One was from the prepaid number, her retired contact, that said only, "Good work." 2 were from numbers she didn't recognize that she didn't answer. One was from Garrett Odom, who said that his brother-in-law had retained him as a client and that federal investigators had reached out that morning to take his pharmacy documents as evidence, and that he was okay, and that he thought she should know. She read that one twice. She made toast again and ate it at the kitchen table in the dark, and she thought about Devlin Marsh upstairs in Ward 4 with Hatch at his knee and the light doing something in the room, and she thought about Joel Pruitt in a Nevada facility being transferred to real care, oriented to person but not reliably to time or place. And she thought about Diane Pruitt, who was a high school history teacher in Reno and had made 11 phone calls and had always known something was wrong from the way the documents didn't sound like her husband. She thought about the version of herself that had walked onto Ward 4 31 days ago, carrying a past she'd compressed into a 2-year employment gap and a set of habits that looked like nursing and were also something else, and she thought about the moment in room 14 when she'd sat at ease without planning to, and understood immediately that she'd given herself away to anyone who knew what to listen for. She hadn't regretted it. She didn't regret it now. But she sat in her kitchen in the dark for a long time with her toast and her coffee and the weight of what the next several months were going to require, and she let herself feel the edges of it before she put it away and went back to bed. The federal depositions began on a Thursday and ran across 4 days in a conference room at the Missoula field office that smelled like carpet cleaner and had a clock on the wall that Claire spent approximately 16 total hours not looking at. She gave testimony about every notation she'd made, every conversation she'd had, every discrepancy she'd documented in the precise sequential order that she'd always processed events. Not dramatically, not with the narrative shaping that lawyers sometimes coached witnesses toward, just the factual account of what she'd observed and why she'd observed it, and what she'd done with the observation. The federal attorney assigned to her case, not the one Voss had recommended, but one from the DOJ's own whistleblower division, a methodical woman named Patricia Quill, who wore the same type of blazer 4 days in a row and asked the same question from 6 different angles until she was satisfied she had it completely, told her on day 2 that she was the clearest opponent she'd worked with in 11 years. "I don't say that to flatter you," Quill said, over bad conference room coffee and a break between sessions. "I say it because clarity is what this case lives or dies on. The defense is going to argue that a suspended probationary nurse with a classified employment history had motivated reasoning. I know what they're going to argue. Does it concern you?" Claire thought about it. "My documentation preceded my suspension. Every notation I made is time-stamped before any administrative action was taken against me. The toxicology is independent and unaffiliated. The pharmacy records are Odom's, not mine." She paused. "They can argue motivated reasoning. The paper trail argues back." Quill looked at her for a moment. "How long were you in the Army?" 8 years? Combat deployment?" "Some of it." Quill nodded slowly, the way people nodded when they were integrating information rather than acknowledging it. "The defense is going to try to make the jury see you as a rogue actor, someone who exceeded her authority because she thought she knew better." "I exceeded my authority because the people with authority were using it to poison a veteran." Claire said it without heat, just the flat factual register she'd used for 4 days. "I'll let the jury decide which of those things matters more." Quill set down her coffee. "Yes," she said. "I think you will." Wallace Oren was arrested on a Wednesday morning outside his home in McLean, Virginia, by 2 FBI agents who had been watching the property for 6 hours and executed the warrant the moment his legal team's emergency injunction attempt failed in federal district court. His attorney released a statement describing the arrest as politically motivated and procedurally irregular. The statement was 3 paragraphs long and contained the word unprecedented twice. Claire read about it on her phone in the parking lot of a grocery store in Grover Falls, and then put the phone in her pocket and went in to buy food. Carl Hendricks resigned his federal appointment 8 days later, on a Friday afternoon, in a statement released at 4:47 p.m. The specific timing of a document designed to land after the news cycle's peak. He cited personal reasons and made no reference to the federal investigation, the DOJ inquiry, or the 7 civil complaints that had been filed against the Office of Veterans Healthcare Policy in the preceding 2 weeks by families of veterans who had been through Helix Meridian-affiliated facilities. His resignation didn't close the investigation. It accelerated it, because a resigned official had fewer protections than a sitting one, and the DOJ's case team had been waiting for exactly that development. The 2 Helix Meridian principals named in the arrest warrants, Douglas Farr and Nathan Brill, entered not guilty pleas and retained a combined legal team that billed at rates that would have funded a small hospital's annual pharmacy budget. The trial date was set for 14 months out, which was a timeline that made Claire's attorney Quill say nothing specific but exhale through her nose in a particular way. Fitch pled guilty to 2 counts of fraudulent medical documentation and 1 count of conspiracy in a federal health program within 6 weeks of his arrest, in exchange for cooperation testimony. His medical license was suspended the same day. The Montana Medical Board revoked it permanently 4 months later after a 7-hour hearing that Claire did not attend but read about in detail. Strand fought everything for 8 months, and then, facing a trial that would have required her to explain a paper trail that no explanation could accommodate, pled no contest to federal conspiracy charges. She received a sentence of 41 months, which her attorney described as disproportionate in a press release that nobody except the attorney's firm seemed to read. She was disbarred from medical administration permanently. Sandra Kell, the pharmacy director, cooperated immediately. Her testimony about the Helix Meridian medication authorization chain was, according to Quill, the single most useful piece of evidence in the entire federal prosecution. Garrett Odom was never charged with anything because he had never done anything wrong. His job at Redstone was eliminated when the hospital underwent federal restructuring, but he had 3 job offers from other Montana medical facilities within 2 weeks of the story breaking publicly, which it did with a thoroughness that surprised him and didn't particularly surprise Claire. She heard all of this in pieces, over months, the way you heard things about a situation you'd been the center of and then had to step back from Quill's updates, from Voss's occasional calls, from the news, from the occasional text from the prepaid number that was always brief and always accurate. What she heard about Devlin Marsh, she heard from Devlin Marsh himself. He called her for the first time 6 weeks after her last day at Redstone, on a Tuesday evening when she was making dinner and not thinking about anything particular. She picked up, and there was a pause. And then his voice, which was different from the voice she'd known in room 14, still low, still spare, but with something in it that had room to breathe that hadn't been there before. "You changed your number," he said. "I changed a lot of things." She turned the stove down. "How are you?" "Better." A pause. "Hatch had a checkup. He's fine." She smiled, which was a thing she was doing more of now that she wasn't operating on 4 hours of sleep in a building where she needed to keep her face neutral at all times. "And you?" "Real medication, real psychiatrist, one who doesn't have a consulting contract with anyone." Another pause. "Sleep is still inconsistent, but Hatch..." He stopped. "It's different with him there." She understood that. "Webb?" she said. "Talking, processing." A long pause. "Polk is slower. The exposure period was longer for him." His voice dropped slightly on that, a weight he was carrying that he'd probably always carry in some form. "They're both out. That's what matters." "Yes," she said. "That's what matters." A brief silence, the comfortable kind. "Pruitt," he said. "I know. I've been following it." Joel Pruitt's recovery had been the one that the news had found most compelling, partly because Diane Pruitt was a high school history teacher who turned out to be articulate and specific and completely unintimidatable when she spoke to reporters, and partly because 14 months was a number that people could hold in their minds and understand in a visceral way. She'd stood outside the Nevada facility on the day her husband was transferred out and said, in the flat, clear voice of someone who had been angry for a long time and had found the right place to put it, "He served this country for 19 years. I want someone to explain to me what kind of country does this to the people who served it." Nobody had a good answer. The clip had been seen a significant number of times. Joel Pruitt's cognitive inconsistencies were, according to his independent neurologist, expected to resolve substantially over a 12 to 18-month period following the cessation of the false medication protocol. His long-term prognosis was cautiously good. He was home in Reno. He was relearning the texture of his own days. "The hearing," Devlin said. "In Washington. Voss called me." "She called me too." Claire moved the pan off the heat entirely. "I'm going." "So am I." A pause. "First time I've been out of Montana in 2 years. You'll be okay." "Yeah?" He said it like a man who had decided something and was comfortable with the decision. "I know." The Senate Veterans Affairs Subcommittee hearing on veteran psychiatric care and private contracting oversight was held on a Tuesday in October, in a room that was larger than it needed to be and had the particular acoustic quality of spaces designed to make human speech sound simultaneously important and small. Claire sat in the witness area in a dark blazer she'd bought specifically for the occasion and looked at the committee members arrayed behind their elevated platform and thought about the first morning on Ward 4. The tray against the wall, the 2 words that had come out of her before she'd thought about them. She had testified in federal depositions for 4 days. This was different. This was a room with cameras and a public record, and senators who had already decided where they stood and were using the hearing to say so in a format that would be clipped and distributed and argued about. She'd been prepared for that too. Her testimony lasted 40 minutes. She delivered it without notes, because the events she was describing were not things she needed notes for. They were things she'd lived in real time, documented in real time, and had spent the subsequent months reconstructing in detail for a federal case that was now proceeding toward trial. She described what she'd observed at Redstone Medical Center. She described what the pharmacy records showed. She described what Devlin Marsh's toxicology had revealed and what that medication was designed to do to a human mind over an extended period. She described Joel Pruitt's condition when he was found. She described Marcus Webb and Terrence Polk. She did not describe these things dramatically. She described them accurately, in the specific language of someone who had been a combat medic and then a nurse, and who understood that clinical facts, stated clearly, were more devastating than any rhetorical shaping she could apply to them. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment before the questioning began. The first senator, a woman from Colorado, whose manner conveyed the efficient displeasure of someone who had been doing this job long enough to stop being surprised and start being angry, said, "Ms. Whitmore, in your assessment, based on what you documented and what the federal investigation has since confirmed, how long had this network been operating before you identified it?" 14 months at minimum within Redstone specifically, Claire said. The Criterion program itself predates that by several years. The private sector continuation, Helix Meridian, appears to have been established as the official program was being discontinued. And in your judgment, would it have continued to operate if you hadn't intervened? She paused for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give it accurately. I think it would have continued until someone with the right combination of training and access and willingness to document was in a position to see it. That might have been me. It might have been someone else. It might have taken longer. She met the senator's eyes. What I know is that it was visible. The evidence was always there. The system required someone to look at it and refused to be told they were looking at the wrong thing. The senator wrote something. And when the hospital told you that you were looking at the wrong thing? They were in the process of building a case to terminate my contract, Claire said, which is a fairly common response to someone who won't stop looking. A murmur moved through the room. She testified for another 30 minutes on the specific policy gaps that had allowed the Helix Meridian contracting chain to function without oversight, the procurement process, the clearance levels that had shielded Criterion's continuation from standard audit mechanisms, the specific way the VA adjacent facility designation had created a regulatory gap that private contractors had exploited. She had prepared this section carefully because the story of what had happened to Devlin Marsh and Joel Pruitt and Marcus Webb and Terrence Polk was one story, and the structural story of how it had been possible was a different one, and the second one was the one that could prevent the next version of it. When she was done, Devlin Marsh testified. He was 2 seats to her left, and she didn't watch him testify. That was his to do without witnesses of a different kind. But she heard his voice, and it was the same voice she'd first heard in room 14 after the tray hit the wall, stripped down and flat and precise. And it was devastating in the same way her own testimony had been, which was to say that it stated facts and let the facts do everything that shock or grief or outrage would have done less efficiently. He was in the room for 55 minutes. When he came back to the witness seats, he sat down without looking at her, and she didn't say anything. And Hatch, who was permitted in the hearing room as a certified service animal and had been lying at Devlin's feet with the patience of a dog who understood that this was part of the job, lifted his head briefly and then put it back down. After the hearing, in the hallway outside the chamber, with the noise of the building around them and the specific post-event exhaustion that came from sustained precision under pressure, Devlin looked at her and said, "You did good in there. So did you. Mine was harder." He said it matter-of-factly, not fishing for contradiction. "Yes," she agreed. "Yours was harder." He nodded once. The nursing board inquiry concluded 4 months after the hearing. Claire had retained independent counsel, the attorney Voss had recommended, a compact and relentless woman named Joan Albrecht, who had the specific quality of someone who found institutional obstruction personally motivating, and had submitted documentation that ran to 312 pages, including every chart notation, every time-stamped entry, every clinical rationale she'd constructed in real time. The board's complaint had been filed by Redstone Medical Center's administration, 4 of whose 5 key administrators were now either serving sentences, awaiting trial, or had resigned under federal investigation. The board voted to dismiss the complaint unanimously. They also issued a formal letter, which Albrecht told her was unusual for a dismissal. Boards typically dismissed without comment, that described Claire's clinical documentation as exemplary and her pattern of patient advocacy as consistent with the highest standards of nursing practice. She read the letter twice and then put it in a drawer. Not because it didn't matter, it mattered, but in the specific way that formal vindications mattered, which was less as emotional resolution and more as a closed procedural loop. The validation she cared about hadn't come from the board. It had come from the room in the early morning with the tray against the wall and a man scanning exits who had stopped scanning when she said 2 words, and from the subsequent 31 days of choosing the harder option repeatedly, and not because it was heroic, but because the alternative was knowing she'd seen something and done nothing about it. She accepted a position at Harlow Veterans Residential Center in Grover Falls 2 months after the board's decision. Not Ward 4 at Redstone. Redstone was being restructured under federal oversight, its psychiatric program dismantled and rebuilt from the foundation, with independent clinical oversight and contracting transparency requirements that Voss's investigation had directly produced. Harlow was a different facility, smaller, with a population of veterans transitioning from acute care to long-term outpatient support. It paid less than Redstone. It had worse parking. The break room had a coffee maker that was always half full and never hot enough. She took the job anyway. Her official title was Clinical Coordinator of Psychiatric Transition Services, which was a title they'd created because she told them what she intended to do, and they hadn't had a category for it. What she actually did was build a patient care framework from the ground up, incorporating what she knew about combat trauma. Not the textbook version, the clinical language that described it from the outside, but the version you understood when you'd been in the spaces where it originated. And what she'd learned in 31 days about the gap between what veterans in psychiatric settings needed and what the system was trained to give them. She hired nurses who asked questions. She prioritized nurses who had operational or military backgrounds, or who had worked in environments that required rapid threat assessment and de-escalation, because those skills translated, and the translation was important, and nobody in the existing training curriculum had acknowledged it. She implemented a policy requiring documented rationale for any medication change within the first 30 days of admission, with mandatory independent pharmacy review. The hospital administrator had said it would slow down the clinical process. Good, Claire said. It slowed down the process by an average of 4 hours per change. In the first 6 months, there were no undocumented medication modifications. There were no undocumented anything. What? She was in the middle of a training session with 6 new nurses, 3 months into the Harlow position, on a Thursday afternoon, going through the specifics of trauma-informed de-escalation in the specific language of people who needed to do it rather than study it. When one of the nurses, a young woman named Priya, who had previously worked in an emergency department and had the quick observational intelligence of someone who learned from watching, said, "How do you know when to step in? Like, when does standard protocol stop being the right call?" The room was quiet. The other 5 nurses were looking at her. She thought about how to answer it and decided to answer it honestly. "You know when the protocol is being used to protect the institution rather than the patient," she said. "That's not always a clear line. Sometimes it's subtle, but it's there, and you'll feel it. And when you feel it, the question you have to ask yourself is whether you're willing to document what you see and stand behind that documentation, regardless of what happens to you professionally." Priya frowned slightly. "What if you're wrong?" "Then you document that too, and you accept the correction, and you get better at making the assessment." She paused. Being wrong about a patient concern is recoverable. Choosing not to document a patient concern because you're afraid of the consequences, that's harder to come back from. Another nurse said, "What if the institution comes after you?" She looked at him. He was older, a former Army medic who'd done 2 tours and come back to civilian nursing, and the question was coming from a specific place. "Let me ask you something," she said. "When you were in the field and a situation was wrong, not ambiguous, actually wrong, and you had to decide whether to call it, what did you think about?" He was quiet for a moment. "Whether I could live with not calling it." "Yes," she said. "That's the standard, not whether the institution will be pleased with you, whether you can live with the choice." The room was quiet again, in the way rooms went quiet when something true had been said plainly and people were deciding what to do with it. Outside, through the window, Grover Falls was doing its late afternoon thing, the light coming down off the mountains in the long, flat way it did in October, and she could see the edge of the parking lot where, 3 blocks north, Redstone Veterans Medical Center was going through its federal restructuring with new administrative leadership and an oversight committee that filed quarterly reports and had actual teeth. She could see all of and also see the training room she was standing in and the 6 nurses who were learning something that wasn't in the standard curriculum. And she thought about the version of herself that had walked into a hospital 31 days before everything broke open. Not particularly confident, not particularly noticed, carrying a past that nobody had asked about, and a set of skills that nobody had recognized, and a willingness to see what was actually there, and to keep looking until she understood what she was looking at. She thought about Devlin Marsh back in Montana, 6 months into real treatment, reporting in a text last week that he'd slept 6 hours in a row for the first time in longer than he could precisely measure. She thought about Joel Pruitt in Reno, relearning the texture of his own days, Diane Pruitt standing beside him at a press conference 3 weeks ago, with the specific expression of a woman who had been fighting alone for a very long time and was still standing. She thought about Marcus Webb and Terrence Polk, both in outpatient programs, both with the long road of real recovery ahead of them, rather than the managed erasure that had been designed for them. She thought about Garrett Odom, who had a new job at a medical center in Billings, and had texted her once to say that he'd started keeping parallel records on everything, and that his brother-in-law said that was probably excessive, and that he was doing it anyway. She thought about Peg Dolan, who had been reinstated after 2 months when Redstone's new interim administration reviewed the administrative leave record and found it thoroughly without merit, and who had called Claire exactly once since then and said, without preamble, "I should have told you to open the notebook." And Claire had said, "You told me when it counted." And Peg had said, "Yeah," and hung up, and that had been the end of it, which was the right end. She thought about Wallace Oren, whose trial was set for March, whose legal team had filed 6 motions and had all 6 denied, and who was going to spend a significant portion of whatever time he had left explaining to a federal jury how a retired general had used a private consulting company to systematically eliminate the cognitive function of decorated veterans who knew something inconvenient. She thought about all of this, and then she came back to the room, to the 6 nurses watching her, to Priya's question still in the air. "The system," Claire said, "is not always wrong. Most of the time it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, imperfectly, with insufficient resources, trying its best." She paused. "But the system can be used against the people it's supposed to protect. That has happened. It will happen again somewhere, in some form, because systems are run by people, and people are capable of using whatever structure they're given for purposes it wasn't designed for." She looked around the room. "Your job? The actual job, not the one in the job description, is to know the difference, to stay close enough to the patient to know when something is wrong, even if nobody is saying it's wrong, even if the documentation says it's fine, even if the physician above you says it's fine." She let that sit for a moment. "The patient is your information. Everything else is a system. You are the point of contact between the system and the person the system is supposed to serve. Don't forget which of those things is real." Priya wrote something in her notebook. The older nurse, the former Army medic, looked at her and gave her a single nod, the specific compact acknowledgement of someone who had understood something they'd already known and had needed to hear in those words. She checked the clock. "We'll pick up tomorrow with the medication documentation protocol," she said. "Questions before we close?" There were questions. There were always questions, from nurses who were trying to figure out how to do the job well in an environment that didn't always make that easy, and she answered all of them with the same patience she brought to everything. Not the performed patience of someone acting calm, but the actual thing, the product of understanding that almost nothing was simple, and that doing the work anyway was the only response to that which made any sense. When the session broke, she stayed in the room for a few minutes after the nurses filed out, looking at the dry erase board where she'd written the session's key framework in her own slightly imperfect handwriting. She'd misspelled one word and corrected it, and the correction was visible. She left it. Her phone buzzed. "Voss, Farr and Brill changed pleas this morning. Guilty on all federal counts. Sentencing in February. Thought you'd want to know." She looked at the message for a moment. Then she wrote back, "Thank you." She put the phone in her pocket and picked up her bag and turned off the lights in the training room and walked down the corridor toward her office, where she had a stack of care protocols to review and a meeting with the hospital administrator in 40 minutes, about expanding the training program to the 2 sister facilities in the region, which would require additional staff and a budget negotiation she was not particularly looking forward to but was entirely prepared to have. She was not a hero. She knew that in the specific way of people who have seen what heroism looks like up close, and understand that it is mostly just a sequence of hard decisions made by imperfect people who chose not to look away. She had been dismissed and threatened and suspended and investigated and doubted, and she had documented everything and kept moving and refused to let the institution's version of reality replace what she'd actually seen. And the people who had told her she was wrong about her assessments, her observations, her instincts, her judgment, were now watching those assessments carry federal cases. She had not been the strongest person in this story. She had not been the most certain or the most fearless or the most righteous. She had been the one who was paying attention in the right place at the right time and had the specific combination of training and stubbornness and particular love for the people the institution had written off, and she had used all of it. That was enough. It was always going to have been enough. Outside the window of her office, Grover Falls was moving into evening, the mountains doing what Montana mountains did at dusk, going dark and enormous and permanent at the edges of a sky that was still holding light longer than it had any reason to. Somewhere on Ward 4 at a restructured hospital 3 blocks north, a veteran who had arrived frightened and been made more frightened was probably being talked to by a nurse who had been told that the most important thing she could give a patient was accurate documentation and 15 minutes of uninterrupted time. Claire sat down at her desk. She opened the protocol stack. She picked up her pen, and she started where she always started, at the beginning, with what she'd actually seen, written down in language clear enough that nobody could argue with it.